And we're live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 11 Bang Bang Reload Show, probably the biggest one we've done yet. And if you couldn't tell from down here beneath us, we got Rob from British Muzzleloaders.
Hi, everybody.
I'm not going to lie. I was really surprised whenever I asked him if he'd be interested in coming on the show here, and he said yes. So we are very happy to have him on here.
Twist my rubber arm about talking about old guns and black powder.
Oh, yeah. Oh yeah,
he is the most dapper gun tuber.
Well, not only for a year.
Yeah. I forgot to mention that he's also the most dapper Gundies Award winner for that category. So if you guys got any questions about 18th century firearms and especially Napoleonic War era, and even up into the P-53s, the Lee-Enfields. Anything British firearms, Rob's going to pretty much know about it.
Well,
so
I put you on the spot here. On too high now.
But let's see here. So anyhow, I got one question for you to start off the bat. Rob, you want to tell us how you got started in black powder?
Well, I used to do some recreational shooting when I was a lot younger, and that sort of ebbed and flowed. My first sort of full bore rifle was an SMLE, the same SMLE as I use on the channel. And then it sort of got put in a closet, and ammunition was expensive, and I moved on to other things. And I guess I can't really remember what the catalyst was, but at some point I figured, well, maybe I'm interested in history, and I sort of started learning more about sort of the Victorian era. And I figured, well, if I'm going to delve into that kind of firearm in terms of muzzle loading or something like that, I'd like to get something probably that I would have a chance of hitting what I was aiming at, yet still be a muzzle loader in sort of that genre. And obviously there's only really one place the arrow points to, and that's in terms of the British and Commonwealth Empire context, that's the P-53. Mm-hmm. So that's the first other part from my SMLE. The first sort of rifle I owned ended up being it was a Euroarms, which is a European reproduction of a P-53. And quite frankly, that's where it all started. That's the basis of the name of the channel. That is the basis of certainly most of the early stuff I did, which is horribly dated at this point, but it definitely holds that place in my heart, because it combines that old and new, being a rifle, but yet being a muzzleloader. It fits that niche very well. And as any viewers of my channel will be aware, it's been a long journey and a lot of exploration about those kinds of things. So that's essentially where it came from. And it's literally just grown from that. And from there, it went to a Brown Bess and went back in time. And then, as we were talking before we went live, the rifle shop at the time was a little bit out of reach for me. Mm-hmm. I ended up finding a reproduction Indian-made Baker that I had rebarreled, and that lasted me for a good number of years. This is all well before the channel, and it's grown from there. And everything you see on the channel, there's probably, almost the same number of arms again that I haven't actually had a chance to bring to the channel yet. So I've slowly but surely sort of amassing the collection and filling holes in that collection, so that I'll be able to sort of represent a continuum from, in this case, the oldest one I have is original is the Brown Bess that I have, but in terms of from 1800 to about, call it 1950 or so.
Yeah.
After that, it gets kind of problematic in owning, military service arms past that date, rather, from sort of the mid 50s onward. So I've sort of had to curtail things at that point, which of course is the bridging point between the Lee-Enfield and what in Canada we would call the FN or the C1A1.
Okay. Yeah. You're talking about, just starting in black powder. Me personally, first one I had was an inline. I had it as a kid, and I didn't really like it just because, it took saboed bullets. It didn't look like the thing you saw in the old movies or whatever, And the next one I got was, and I didn't actually get it, my brother Caleb got it, was an Indian-made land pattern musket, or we call it nowadays, the long land pattern. And I fell in love with that gun. I was out there that same day shooting a Steyr-AUG, and I put the Steyr-AUG away, and I spent the rest of the day shooting the land pattern musket just because it was so much fun.
Good man.
Yeah. And ever since then, I've been hooked. I just love muskets and rifles now.
Well, let me say that the work that you're doing, it looks really good. You're combining a good sort of mix of the historical piece with the actual, practical applications of it, the shooting accuracy testing, all that kind of stuff. So that's stuff I love to see coming from other channels as well, especially in the genre that you're dealing with. Is it's not, perhaps, as I can attest, it's not necessarily a huge genre, and it's not the big magnet that draws people to it. But for those that are interested, people tend to gravitate to that stuff. So it's good you're filling that niche for sure.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. We're trying to. Sometimes things don't go as they were planned, like today, but we'll give it our best shot. Let's see here. Yeah, if you guys got any questions in here, this is your time to ask. I think I've asked you a few questions on your. I asked you one. I think I had my Charleville. I'd asked you. I was like, "Hey, I've got rust stains on the steel. How do I get this thing polished up?" Brick dust.
Yeah.
I used it. It works.
That works.
Yep. Use a good old brick dust.
That's one of my favorite parts about this hobby as well. Is the fact that there's a lot of information to study, and no matter what you get, there's always going to be something else in the next line that you're going to want to complete the entire storybook of whatever it is. And it could be a hobby that can last a lifetime, just constantly replacing to something newer.
Yeah. No kidding.
Talking to these guys about, I'm taking an Indian made version of it, of course, the Paget carbine. And I'm trying to make a historically accurate Paget carbine out of an Indian reproduction, which I'm finding is a chore because they changed a lot on that gun, but I'm making some headway. But there's just so much information on that little Paget if you know where to look, but nobody's ever talked about it. And it's a really nice little carbine. Let's see here. We got one comment here. Is the long land pattern brown vest more accurate than the short land pattern?
In terms of like ultimate accuracy, or in a range setting using all kinds of perhaps ahistorical techniques, it stands to reason it might be slightly, but in reality, in terms of practical accuracy, especially on the battlefield, absolutely not.
Yeah, enough. And not that it would probably really matter anyways, because the only point when you're really going to need not even precision, but minute of man accuracy out of a musket in the 18th century is skirmishers. And I don't know, I may be wrong, but I don't think I've ever heard of skirmishers. I mean, they might have earlier on, but I've never really heard of skirmishers getting issued the long land pattern once the short land pattern comes along. But I could be wrong on that.
Well, you look at the history of sort of the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War, sort of things before the American Revolution. Yep. And you do, especially when light infantry was such a very ad hoc, very in theater, specifically raised for the campaign kind of arm. Like, it wasn't fully matured yet. So especially in North America, they realized they really needed that. And that's when you get all those really famous old regiments and, Rogers Rangers and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
And in terms of what I've read anyway, certainly, field modifications, cutting weapons down to suit, as opposed to what would be an ordnance pattern arm being made specifically for them, like we see later on. So, it took, that's, maybe 50 years almost before the light infantry arm sort of fully matured and became in British service, of course, and became a permanent aspect of the British Army anyway, and by extension, those are the Empire.
So I believe, and I'm trying to think here, because I know the British adopted the P-76 or the pattern 1776 rifle, but they only adopted 1,000 of them. the 800 that were British made and the 200 Hanoverian designs guns. But you really don't see, like you were saying, you really don't see that. I may be wrong. I'm trying to think here. The British start to get that light infantry rifle at around 1800, correct? That's
Yeah,
when
I mean
it
the
really starts to
Baker
pick up
comes
again.
into service. The first pattern is the 1800
Yep.
Baker. It's also important to realize that where the lineage of that comes from, and you mentioned the 1776 rifle.
Yep.
That came out of an identification that the rifles that had been brought over by the Germans,
Mm-hmm.
right,
The,
and their tradition of light infantry, that Jaeger tradition, and
Yep.
those short, handy rifles that they gravitated to. Well, they brought them with them, and their way of warfare, which obviously
Mhm.
flourished in certain aspects in North America. So, when you go back that extra step, as DeWitt Bailey has so well established in his book, that's the one.
Mhm.
I
And
brought it with me.
yeah, that's good. I think mine's on the shelf back here somewhere, down here or over here. And it really sort of opened up the eyes, so to speak, that, oh, wait a minute, there actually was an actual service rifle, an ordnance pattern rifle. Well, almost two patterns really, because as much as the Hanoverian one and the British one are of the same family, they do have a very different look to them, and one is very Germanic and one is very British. But the overall tradition of it, the sort of medium bore, short barreled Jaeger rifle with a scroll type trigger guard, all those kinds of things, you can definitely see that lineage, and it's carried right forward to the Baker. And it's actually in those very early years of the 1800s where the British finally, after the initial experience fighting during their French Revolution, and they did have the light infantry, but the light infantry was just a part of every battalion, much like it was during the American Revolution. And they realized that the French way of warfare dealt a lot with light infantry, and they needed something to counter the larger numbers. And they ended up going with three regiments, which were all single battalion organizations. And they brought them all together in southern England, and they trained them extensively. And these particular ones were picked because of either capabilities or something that the establishment saw in them in terms of the manpower, the character of them.
Mm-hmm.
And what you get there is the genesis of the permanent established light infantry arm within the British Empire sort of armies. And that forms initially a brigade, the Light Brigade, which then grows into the Light Division, which you see in service during the Peninsular War in Spain later in the 1810s, essentially.
Yeah.
And there's upwards of 10 light infantry regiments by the time of Waterloo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because there's a need for that kind of capability on the battlefield, but you can trace it back. Well, obviously, as we just mentioned, you can trace it back in a straight line, unbroken, to about 1800 or 1801 when the battalions went to Shorncliffe. 1802, maybe. The exact year is escaping me, but it's around there. But that sort of corporate knowledge of what light infantry was within the army, but just not at the same scale. And you go back to the American Revolution, light companies were a fixture of all British infantry battalions, and certain attention should be paid to the fact that the army in general, much like it did in the Peninsula, really adapted itself. The British Army I'm speaking of adapted itself to the conditions of warfare in North America, and the use of what otherwise would be considered light infantry tactics, more extended order, faster movement on the battlefield, all that kind of stuff, really took hold across the whole British Army as the way they needed to operate in North America, which is a really good point that is often overlooked. And not trying to, how do I put it, be overly
simplistic about it.
But... No, not simplistic, but often in the American context, that aspect is either forgotten about or ignored, or simply not understood.
It is. Right? Yeah, I definitely understand where you're going for that.
That was a point I was going to bring up because, like I was saying, the British basically adopted the rifle as the Baker in 1800, and that was the big adoption of that rifle. And over here in America, we kind of go with the whole theory of, the Revolutionary War we talk about, a lot of guys will say was won by the rifle, that's a myth. But America doesn't adopt an actual official rifle aside from a handful of, I think, 1790 and 1792 contract rifles. They don't really adopt one until 1803 with the 1803 Harper's Ferry. So yeah, we actually were a little bit behind the British on actually officially adopting a rifle for our standing armies.
Right.
Aside from like militias using rifles.
It's something that's interesting to me though, is that trying to place in context when you talk about the adoption of a rifle in terms of military service, then yes. To say that there's a difference or they relate to the game, especially in those times, 1 or 2 years, it matters absolutely not, because they may adopt something, whether American or British, in a given year and lend that number to the pattern of whatever arm they're talking about. But that's when they adopt it. Then it has to be built in the suitable numbers. It has to be put into supply depots, and it has to be shipped to the various units that need them or have been chosen for them. So this process takes a while. And in the case of the British, it took a year or two for the rifles to be made and then issued, and then the troops to train with them. And certainly in British service, the rifle is not it's a specialty weapon. Within the greater light infantry arm, for sure. The training that a rifleman received is the same tactically in terms of where to stand and how kind of spacing that you use and the tactics you'd use on the battlefield. Their tactics are exactly the same as would be used by the red-coated light infantry regiments, which of course would be armed with the Brown Bess, a smoothbore musket, right? So it was just the capability of that rifle. It was obviously different and much superior in certain regard, but the tactics, the maneuver was common to all light infantry regiments, but also the light infantry companies within the various infantry battalions, right?
Yeah.
How do you think that on the British side they're adopting and using of? Because every time I've always heard about the American Revolution, they always talked about, especially with light infantry, they're starting to use a little bit more guerrilla tactics, a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit. How do you think that it went to the adoption and the creation of newer rifles when they started going from the European style of Napoleonic fighting to middle of the woods, more or less, still light infantry tactics, but a little bit of guerrilla fighting?
Right. I mean, when you talk about light infantry and guerrilla, I'd say that they're very.
They are different.
They hold a certain sort of meaning when we just sort of use them like that. If you're talking about hitting and running and hiding out, exposing yourself at very opportune moments, often against weak, undefended, targets, which by definition then are not necessarily important, right? Because if it's really important, you're going to protect them, you're going to fortify the location, you're going to do all these things, and those by definition are not targets of guerrilla action. Right. And then, therefore, by definition, guerrilla warfare very rarely wins wars.
Yep.
Right.
100% true. Yes.
So now, having said that, of course,
it always tires the people back home out first.
What's that? Sorry.
It usually tires out the people, not the military itself. It usually gets people tired of the losses versus overall large combat. You might win every big war, but it turns into attrition.
Certainly, I say, in saying that it doesn't win the war, it certainly is a large piece of it, to the reasons why you just mentioned, right? Of course, I'm not trying to discount it at all, but when we speak of sort of light infantry action, is guerrilla warfare part of that? Not perhaps in a formal military sense. The guerrilla action is much more, informal in terms of training, in terms of people that are sort of picked or chosen or gravitate to that kind of stuff, much like commandos later on in the 20th century. Those initial bunch of people were all sort of handpicked different kind of cats that didn't fit in elsewhere.
Right.
And so you tend to, those kinds of people gravitate to that kind of thing. But in terms of, conquering a people or fighting large scale actions, there is, light infantry work is not just guerrilla hit and run stuff. Of course, it's literally at its most basic form. If there's one way to describe light infantry work, it's just spacing out more.
Yep.
Yeah, kind of a stopgap between flanks.
So
For sure.
from what I've kind of gathered about the light infantry of the time is more or less harass the enemy, taking shots. Depending on which time period you're talking about. In the Revolutionary War, Daniel Morgan he actually took, and everybody talks about, oh, they just fought in the trees or whatever. No, Daniel Morgan would get his men out, in 2-man groups, one man with a smoothbore, one man with a rifle, basically what the British did. And he'd get them out kind of on line, spaced out apart. And their job was obviously, they targeted officers, NCOs, trying to break the chain of command. However, their main job was trying to get a volley to fire on them, trying to get that, from what I was reading that he was talking about, trying to get that moment of opportunity where you could get a volley to fire at you, and then your regular infantry can do their job. But let's see here. And that's what I always...
Well, when you talk about those kinds of things, you really...
to provoke them.
True enough, but to realize, and I'm not particularly familiar with the actual anecdote that you might be referring to, or anecdotes, or the way that these people sort of wage war, but to just the context of it, in terms of they were obviously seeing a way in which they could, in their mind, effectively engage the British in this case, and trying to use what they saw as being the conventions that the British used to their own advantage, right? To the American advantage. Yeah. And whether it was some sort of luring or decoying, those kinds of things are very intimate, like very, what might work in one particular area of the continent or
not work in the other.
May not be the way they operate in another. And so having that sort of intimate knowledge of your enemy like that is certainly an asset. And I would say that the same thing could be looked at in the reciprocal, that in seeing the way Americans fought, the British, sort of did adapt their tactics in order to try and achieve. You guys have all read With Zeal and Bayonets Only?
What's that?
Say that again.
With Zeal and Bayonets Only?
I have not read that one.
Stop. I'm just looking for it here. Hold on.
If it's half as good as the last one you pointed at, which Turkey Creek 1823 was asking what this book was, guys, this is the British Military Flintlock Rifles book, 1740 to 1840 by DeWitt Bailey. This is a really good read. Like, I can sit there and honestly just be fascinated with the stuff you can find in this book. So,
do you think I could find it just off the shelf here somewhere? There's books all around me here, and I can't seem to find it. Anyway, it's called With Zeal.
That's the best.
Like Zeal, Zeal, and Bayonets Only. And it's probably, if you guys familiar with Brandon F.
Brandon F. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So he's mentioned it quite a few times, and certainly points, in some of his discussions towards that. It's a particularly really eye-opening book, I found anyway. And not being from any particular side or looking at it with any particular bent, but it certainly is written more from the British context and in the examination of anecdotes, accounts, direction, official military direction. The authors, and of course the author is escaping me right now, but brings it all together and analyzes these aspects to bring to light perhaps a more realistic picture of the way the British Army fought in North America. And I mean, it's the kind of thing that everyone's familiar with that famous painting of Bunker Hill with the 3 ranks of British grenadiers marching up the hill, like that. If there's one image of the American Revolution that I would say across the world people will gravitate to in terms of the fighting during the American Revolution, that's probably it. That, or maybe the engagement in Lexington at the beginning, but the book, when you read it, it really, really opens your eyes to this aspect that picture, the painting at Bunker Hill, although holds sway with the popular conception, it absolutely was not the way the vast majority of the war was fought by the British. And it started that way at that battle. And indeed, there's so many accounts, both eyewitness and otherwise, of the way they fought there, and it certainly applies to that battle. But so quickly after that moment, the army begins to change. It gets rid of all the fur hats and the super fancy garments, and the British army in the field ends up looking like something you'd hardly recognize. Are you based on DeWitt Bailey?
Yes.
Have you guys seen? Of course. Oh, there it is. You guys might be interested in that. Have you seen that one too?
I got this one, which it's different. It's a lot smaller. It's British armed or small arms, the British forces in America.
Okay.
Okay. No, I haven't got that one yet, but I need to get it.
It's by the same
DeWitt
guy.
Bailey. Okay.
DeWitt Bailey. And it talks a little bit about the 1776. But I would say predominantly the 1776 is covered in more detail in the Green Book.
Yeah.
But this is, as you mentioned, saw the dates there. It's a bit more comprehensive as far as that goes. But I mean, here's an example of a chapter.
Oh yeah.
You got to get it here. So I mean, British Army marksmanship. It talks a lot about that. It talks about ammunition, and it goes right through to the War of 1812, obviously. But I was going to just pick a picture. Here's, I'm sure you guys are familiar with. Was it Don? I can't remember how to pronounce his last name. Trioni? I can't pronounce it.
Trelawney?
Yeah, that's the guy. I mean, he's very, very good style of artwork. And, that's an example of a light dragoon armed with the aforementioned 1776 rifle.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So acting in a dismounted light dragoon at the time would have been essentially a mounted infantryman capable of both mounted and dismounted action. And as you saw in that picture, he was carrying a knapsack. That's an example of there's another picture of that was an example of the British light infantry arm during the American Revolution. Yeah. There's a picture of a German. I say that in a colloquial sense, in a general sense. They were from all over the German states, but you can see there of the rifle he's carrying, which of course is a German Jaeger rifle.
Yep.
And that lineage, 1776, and subsequently the Baker draws on. It's a straight line, eh? Straight line.
Yeah. That patch box is a pretty big giveaway.
Yeah. I'm flipping through to show you, based on that uniform piece I was talking about, that the British Army in the field becomes something totally different to that Bunker Hill kind of characterization. So if you can bear with me as I flip through and find it.
Yeah. I'm doing some flipping through here myself at the other DeWitt Bailey book. I just thought you might find this funny. I don't know if you probably have read the little book of British military long arms. It's just the little. I think it was one of his earlier books.
Who wrote that?
It's DeWitt Bailey.
DeWitt Bailey. I've got one similar. Yeah, it's what goes through from like the 1600s to I don't know 1860 or something.
But I find it funny because he goes through the muskets and the carbines, and he gets up to the rifles, and he writes in here. He says that the early history of the use of the rifle in British service prior to 1800 is sadly dimmed by the lack of documentary information. And as this volume deals out with issue weapons, whatever, basically he says there's not enough information out there really to write about rifles. So then he proceeds to write this book afterwards. I just thought that was funny. I was like, well, he went down a rabbit hole.
He certainly did. And I mean, that's a perfect example of sort of the way things evolve and research gets better. That first book was, I think, written in the 70s or something like that.
Yeah, it's 70.
Right?
I think
and then the Green Book only came out in 2000 something, as I recall.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. So there's a large pause there while things are collected and research is done, whether it was specifically to write a book or not, or just, as you say, down those rabbit holes. And that's interesting. And all of a sudden you end up with all this material that I need to put that in a book, don't I?
Yeah.
Boy, I can relate to that with Colt.
There's some more just out of the book. There's some more pictures of sort of British soldiers, later on.
Okay.
They adapt their kit. You can see his hat there on the top.
Yeah. The
he's uncocked it, and now it's just a big sun hat.
Yeah,
Right?
that's what I was going to say. I've seen that a time or two, and mostly on pictures of the Southern campaign down in the Carolinas.
Yeah.
They do that. So, okay.
There's another really good one of a light infantryman in here. Oh, there we are. So he's wearing a sort of a characteristic light infantry hat, which is like a leather with the peak at the front sort of points upward.
Okay.
A bit of feathers, but I mean, look how simple that is. He's wearing a short little red jacket, the gaitered trousers or overalls.
Really starting to see similarities going to the Napoleonic War uniform starting to
Yeah,
form with that one.
I mean, and to an extent, I guess, but that right there is because that Bunker Hill picture with the cocked hat, the tricorn all cocked up and the standing in three ranks, marching, it doesn't work in the forest, but that does, doesn't it? Right?
Oh yeah.
Very low profile, not a lot of adornment. You don't need it, and so that book I was referring to with Zeal and Bayonets only really sort of, and I'm looking past the camera here to look on the bookshelf to see if I can find it, because it really is something that
that is fascinating. You're getting into that, Rob, because like for myself, I kind of study more of the Civil War to 1880, 90s ish, and not earlier. But it is kind of fascinating because the whole time I ever grew up, it was always looked at that the British never adapted; they just kind of stayed where they are. This is kind of the way I've always heard it or seen it, and it's kind of fascinating to see that they not only adapted, but they adapted quickly. Because I mean, you're obviously going to if you're seeing what works and what doesn't. Mm-hmm. And it is fascinating to see how fast they adapted to that, changing of uniform, changing a rifle, everything to adapt to a force or wherever they're at for the ability to fight.
The rifle piece, I think, it needs a bit of just sort of contextualization there, because it as you mentioned earlier, there was 200 German versions and then there was 800 British versions, so 1,000 weapons, some of which are going to be in store, held in reserve. They're not going to issue 1,000 out without any spares. And so, when you look at the overall British commitment in North America, how many battalions? Quite frankly, I can't tell you right now. You take an expert, but I know that the overall numbers, sort of by Napoleonic standards, are not great.
Not very high.
Right? Not very high at all. We talk of the largest battles being fought with sort of tens of thousands, right?
Yeah.
But most of that, the smaller actions are sort of sub 10,000, right?
Yeah.
And so one thing that I know DeWitt Bailey wasn't able to comment necessarily on, although there is evidence of that, like the picture I showed you with the light dragoon with his 1776 rifle. There's evidence of is it the 17th light dragoons or the 14th? I can't remember which one it was, that were specifically issued sort of a company or squadron's worth. To see how those rifles were actually issued. Was there a detachment formed sort of in various battalions? Were they used strictly by light infantry troops? It's hard to say because the information in that DeWitt Bailey has found and has put in his book, those facts haven't fully developed yet. To say that there was a formed unit of riflemen along the lines of the 95th of Napoleonic fame, which is a whole regiment of multiple battalions, each of which are fighting in different areas, mind you. But that's an entire unit of riflemen. I can't, specifically say, and I'd probably, if I put money on it, I would say absolutely not. It was a feature in the American Revolution as regards to the 1776 rifle, right? That it would have been sort of penny parceled out in a sharpshooter role, again, augmenting that general sort of light infantry capability within the army, right?
I got you. Okay, that makes that. I can understand that.
Yeah.
So like what you were saying about the pattern 1776, I think, like you were saying, most of them are just kind of scattered out, one for this regiment, one for that company or whatever. But I found, and it wasn't in DeWitt Bailey's book, I think it was the Royal Armories was talking about it, that there were actually quite a few of them issued out to Benedict Arnold's troops after he goes ahead and transfers over to the British side, because he had I can't remember what size, if it was a battalion or a regiment, but his group was mainly made up of Tories, Americans, who are very familiar with a rifle. And so there are actually a lot of those handed out to them. When I say a lot, like you say, it's kind of a lot is, you got to put it in perspective. You've only got 1,000 to work with in the first place, and you don't even have that because a lot of them are in reserve. But no, going on to what you were saying about earlier about the way a lot of the times it's taught here in America about the Revolutionary War is that the British form of combat never evolved during the whole war, which is it's so off because you just see from the start of the Revolutionary War when you get to and I know it's a lot further on down the road, but you get to the Napoleonic War. If you look at the actual tactics, it's almost indistinguishable just how much it's changed. I mean, of course, we're still fighting. You still got linear combat, linear warfare, but there's just, like you say, you go from having two guys, one guy with a rifle, one guy with a musket, to now we've got entire, like the 95th, all armed with Baker rifles.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I found that interesting. Let's see here.
Well, there's certainly similarities in the style of warfare. I mean, North America, does, as it did in the earlier, conflicts, the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War, as known in North America from time to time. And even before, right from frontier days in the 1600s, is the nature of the country, in terms of the geography, is so much different, and you need to adapt to that kind of thing. And the wide open plains and fields don't necessarily exist, right? And the nodes at which you are focusing your attention on, whether they be population centers or resource centers or harbors or ports or this, whatever it may be, the ground around those places is wilderness. It's not, I say civilized, but it's not, it hasn't been lived on by high numbers of people and cultivated, the forests haven't been cut down yet, all that kind of thing. Right. So it's sort of by necessity, and they find that out, during those earlier wars. We look at the battle at Quebec, for instance, that is a complete European style, battle. Yeah, the armies are lined up facing one another, and the British advance, and meet the French, and they exchange volleys, and one side breaks, and the battle's over. Essentially, I'm oversimplifying things, of course, but there's all kinds of application of light infantry work, whether it be from indigenous people who have sided with both sides, or one or the other, I should say. There's groups that sided
depending
with the
on the tribe,
sided with the French, and they're heavily engaged on the flanks, just like they would be in any other kind of situation. That kind of that way of fighting was not. It may not have been the complete focus of any British or Empire army, but it was certainly understood to a degree, and it took something perhaps like the American Revolution, where a bit of a paradigm shifted for the British Army anyway, to really, I'd say embrace, but out of necessity really, is to change, right? And to really sort of double down on, we need to adapt our tactics and our ways of doing things to this environment that we're in right now, because clearly we can't apply, very close dressing and, massed troops in the middle of,
forest
or old growth forest with massive trees and all this kind of thing. So it becomes something that out of necessity is bred. And then, of course, after the American Revolution, that whole emphasis, they call it the American Scramble, which is the British tactics of the era were actually based on a 3-rank formation. And coming out of the 1700s, it very much is. And that actually exists up until the early 1800s, technically in the drill book throughout the entire Napoleonic War. But in North America, they almost immediately moved to a 2-rank line. And when applicable, especially once the army starts training and adapting to the new paradigm, as it were, they open the files out, they space people out more, so that as you're advancing, oh shoot, there's a tree in front of me. Well, I have room to move to my left or move to my right, so that I'm
going to do so,
so I can get around that tree, instead of bumping into the guy who's touching my shoulder on both sides. Right?
Call that funny, but my time in the military, I would have seen somebody stop at that tree and stay there. No joke.
Mackenzie.
When we would do boards,
Mackenzie.
When we do promotion boards, our sergeant major for fun would tip the chair on its side, and I'm not joking to you. 5 out of maybe 10 would sit in the chair sideways on the ground, like sideways. Not joking. It's that's kind of why when I hear about McKinsey, it's like you got it perfect. I'm curious. Did you serve in the military, or did you learn this from reading?
Mackenzie's just a figment of my imagination.
Because you nailed it on the head so well that it's almost like I would have thought that you would have probably at least spent several years in the military. Because we all know a couple of McKinseys if you serve.
Oh yeah.
And you pulled it off so well.
Yeah. So
I call that hobby grade effects.
Oh, it works
because they're really not high quality at all. But there's just what I can do and enough to make the point. So
it works, and you get it across perfectly. As a matter of fact, there's very few even like comical books you can read while you're in the military that pull it off as well as you do. You did a great job with that.
Well, thank you.
So not to change the subject or anything, but so another one I've been reading a lot here lately, and this is by Haythornthwaite, is Weapons and Equipment
that's
of the Napoleonic Wars. Yeah. And it goes into a lot more than just the weapons and equipment. It goes into some of the formations and stuff, and I haven't read this one all the way through yet. Mainly I got it for the Paget carbine.
Yep.
Which there's very little information in there on the Paget. But so you're talking about the formations and how the British switched from a 3-line to a 2-line in the Revolutionary War. So what about when we go back to the Napoleonic Wars later on down the road and you're facing the fairly infamous French column?
Right.
Do they go back to a 3?
Yeah, no. As I say, the drill book maintains 3 ranks all the way through the war. The drill book comes out in 1792. And then subsequently there are abridged versions, sort of not dumbed down, but some of the more complicated stuff is taken out so that you can focus on the stuff you really need to know. And those editions come out sort of in I've got them. A lot of the digital versions are out there. 1807, I'm thinking. I'd have to look through my list, but they come out subsequently, and sort of the 1792 gets amended right up until right before Waterloo in 1815, and so they start and change some things, making emphasis on things they found that are more effective. But in terms of the formal sort of battalion on parade, it still remains a 3-rank line. But for all intents and purposes, it becomes 2 ranks. And by the time the army's sort of well committed permanently in Spain, it's 2 ranks is sort of the way it is. And no one would even think of using 3.
Yeah.
And it's just, is it partly to do with sort of the British way and that experience of the American Revolution had some lasting effect? There's a really good book on British light infantry. Oh God, I wish I had the list I go through. I'd find all these books so I could hold them up for you. But it as well is a very telling volume. It's called the British Light Infantry Arm or something along those lines. But it goes through and it just talks about the development and the institution of that permanent light infantry piece from 1800-ish on.
I'm getting from about 1800 to even Napoleonic War, you're going to have a lot of NCOs and officers that served in those campaigns, so they would have learned those lessons like the hard way and also, kept them going instead of it changing, or am I wrong?
Well, one of the points made in this particular book is that after the American Revolution is over, there is some degree of sort of, well, we got to get back to real soldiering now. The revolution was definitely a bit of an anomaly, especially when as regards to European warfare and the way that the European sort of way of war. And there's a certain get rid of that. As I say, the term American scramble is something that's used somewhat in a derogatory way to say, well, that's the way that you fight over there, which maybe isn't like real fighting. Obviously, it's completely real in that.
Well, context. The military hasn't changed much. Don't worry. Like right after Vietnam, we were fighting, still like pretending we're going to go into every forest in the world, and then holy crap, we're going to go in the desert. Now we don't teach anything about forest, only desert.
Only desert, right?
You'd be surprised, Trapper. Yeah. They've gone back.
Have they really? Yeah, I've been out for a little bit now, but
right?
Yeah, my time in, you would have been like, hey, likely at the time we could have gone into a forest or jungle warfare. Nope, never even learned a bit. Not important. Don't need to know it.
Right.
Yeah. So another thing you kind of got me pointed onto was, and I haven't read the books yet, but the series Sharp.
No.
And it's pretty good. It's a pretty good series. I know there's a lot of things wrong with it, especially when I look down the barrel and I see a nice smooth bore on the Baker, and I see the swan neck on the cock on the Baker. But you know what? You can look over those things.
Oh yeah.
But
no. I think.
There he is.
Yeah, I think for me that the Sharp. I mean, I read them when they came out in like the 80s, and I couldn't put them down. I just loved every time that they couldn't wait to get to the end of the book. Just read and read and read, because they're really, really good stories.
Yeah.
And he writes a really, really good story. And was that well, I certainly probably would never have known about the Baker rifle if it wasn't for Bernard Cornwell writing those books. But certainly once you start actually becoming serious and learning about him, you realize that Sharp as a historical entity, well, it simply isn't. Right?
Yeah.
And just to make sure that whatever attention you put towards Sharp and the stories, whether it be the books or the television shows, perhaps more of the television shows, take a little bit more liberty with things. But
what, spit loading wasn't a thing?
I was just going to say that.
Did you? Sorry, go ahead. I just said what, spit loading wasn't a thing.
That's a debate for another day.
That's a debate for another day.
But those kinds of things, right? Is that they're in the story, and then it's the ever present back and forth between people who are interested in history and people who are just interested in the story and think it's history, or don't go any farther past that and actually learn the history. And so I always make jokes on the channel when everyone mentions Sharp, especially when Baker stuff is out there.
Yeah.
Because it's like, don't mention that's a 4-letter word on this channel. And just because, with tongue in cheek, of course, because invariably there's references to spit loading, and that's the way they did it. And there's references. I think you mentioned about the walking and running piece just recently in a comment. There's the walking and running piece. Well, try it. Go out and try that and do it for an hour and see if it's the best way to move around. And it 100% isn't.
It's not.
And I'm sure what that was Bernard Cornwell trying to apply the concept that riflemen move quickly on the battlefield and dreamt up something like that. But running for 6 paces and walking for 6 paces is junk. I mean, it'll kill you. Right? Yeah. Just run for 10 minutes and walk for 10 minutes. Yeah. But this whole back and it's ridiculous. But in the story, it's like some sort of super ability they have, and they can cover ground faster. So those kinds of things are very, ahistorical. There's all kinds of anecdotes about long marching, but no one marches like that from A to B to get an army from one spot to another, because it's an army. It's thousands of men moving with all this baggage and everything, but it's just got to move quickly. So it just keeps going. It doesn't stop. And so when they get there, the next day, they've marched 35 miles or 50 miles or whatever it is, and they're just done. Because they never stopped. Yeah. Not because they ran 5 paces and walked 5 paces. They would have lasted half an hour, and then they all would have been shot.
I saw that when I was watching it, and I was like, that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it does sound like something that the Army would make us do, because they thought that it would sound good. So I got to ask. But another thing I noticed on that was, you mentioned the spit loading, which, not a thing you're going to see a regular Army doing. But I did look into it because I was going to make a little video on it. And I found several sources, especially talking about, American Revolutionary War, of, I believe, at Elizabethtown in Guilford Courthouse, where there were militia, mind you, they're not regular soldiers, who were using fowling pieces. And they're talking about, the British bayonet charge bearing down on them. And a lot of people talk about the militia kind of in a derogatory term. They always tend to break and run. And I was thinking about it a little bit. They don't have bayonets. It's like you're really up a creek, and I got this rifle here with me now. It's Kibler Woods Runner. You don't want to take something like this and try to club somebody with it. They're not made for it, especially here at the wrist. So yeah, breaking and running is probably your best
only
bet.
tactic. Yeah.
But the source I had read, the guy was talking about they were actually made paper cartridges for their Fowlers. And he was talking about they would take and they would prime, they would bite the ball off the cartridge, prime, and pour the powder down the barrel and then spit the ball down the barrel, basically the Sharp method. But another guy I was reading about was talking about they'd actually take and bite the tail off the cartridge, prime, pour the powder charge, and then set the cartridge in the barrel and let it roll down. Or that's at least what he did, because he was issued a incorrect cartridge size. He was issued I think he's issued a 69 caliber cartridge for a French musket, and he had a Brown Bess. So I actually tried that out, just messing around, and I found that at 150 yards, I could hit a man-sized target about 3 out of 4 times in a minute. So it actually worked pretty good. Now, if it was ever used, no, it most likely wasn't used. You'd get in a lot of trouble for doing that, I imagine. But I did find that kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Loading from the
That
mouth.
is interesting.
The other piece is that if there may have been an anecdote of, biting the bullet off the cartridge and spitting in the barrel, I often wonder if the anecdote just half of it has been forgotten.
Yeah.
But if that was the way that you use the cartridge, you spat it into the barrel. Of course, when you bite the bullet off, it's got the paper on it. So you're taking the paper off the bullet in your mouth with your tongue, right?
Yep.
And then then you go and spit the bullet down the barrel. Well, it was the use of the ramrod after the fact. But in terms of the popular conception of that, obviously is no. It just rolled all the way down.
Not going to happen.
Right. But is that where it comes from?
Yeah.
That instead of when you do bite, you're not biting the tail of the cartridge, you're biting the bullet off.
Right.
And you go and spit it in the barrel, and then you take your ramrod out and ram it down to make sure that it's there. I mean, conceivably that could be the case. I mean, in the sense of a smoothbore, the crux of this whole thing is the use of the ramrod or not, right?
Yeah.
And quite frankly, if that bullet is covered in paper, it ain't going anywhere. I mean, it might slide down somewhere, but after 2 or 3 or 4 rounds, the chances of your fouling being to the degree that it's going to hang up on the paper, roll. And if that paper is if it's rucked up a little bit or misshapen, it's going to increase the chances of that catching in the barrel. But I know, I just was out actually a few days ago shooting my Brown Bass and my F pattern percussion musket in a firepower video, and in both of those using a 69 caliber ball, which is sort of the service round of the era for that entire time. That the cartridge I make and the mandrel I use, that when I do tear the tail off in my mouth and pour the powder down, and you just pour the powder and just follow it with the whole cartridge with the bullet in it, and you don't even have to wait and pause as long as you've torn the tail off reasonably and there's a large opening. You don't have to sit there and pour it. You just put it in there and it all falls out. And if the cartridge with the bullet starts moving down the barrel, which it will do because of the mandrel I use, you know, I can hear it. It's like, and sometimes it goes all the way down. Sometimes it doesn't. That doesn't negate me using the ramrod, right? But that is the case of that perfectly formed paper cartridge being intact at the muzzle and being able to sort of slide down. But I tell you, if I pinch it with my thumb for whatever reason and it puts a dent in the side of it, then it gets hung up on the fouling and it doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah. Right? So you were talking about ripping the paper off in your mouth or whatever. What I found was, and I was using a paper cartridge design that was a British style of basically where the paper's folded over and then the tube is formed around the ball sets on the paper, the folded piece. What I found was, and I was using a pewter I'd bought off of Townsend's. Basically, you get kind of the same properties of lead without, all the fun lead poisoning. And I'd bite that ball off, and then I'd spit it off in my hand because I don't want to be spitting it down the barrel, putting my face over a loaded gun. And I'd spit it into my hand, and I found I could actually bite onto that bit of paper, and it would spit right out there in my hand and drop right down the barrel. And it worked fairly well, but, like you say, it's probably not something that you want to be doing when you're trying to, actually hit something.
Right. Well, and in the sense that, I mean, all these smoothbore muzzle muskets, they were intended, especially in a military context, when you're trying to form that Continental Army, for example.
Yeah.
That army is being formed to fight in that style. So the men in it need to be trained, they need to be drilled, and that they need to be trained in a common doctrine, and the drills used for their weapon need to be taught and practiced again and again and again.
Yep.
And so
Mackenzie over there spitting balls down the barrel.
yeah.
Yeah.
As a militiaman who maybe have lesser training, or so somebody in a Minuteman connotation, who is literally a farmer and grabs his Fowler or his musket or whatever he's got and runs, and they muster and off they go for the time being. They're going to use a method that they are familiar with when they are using their weapon in the bush for civilian purposes.
That makes a lot of sense.
And that may not have anything to do with the way they may use powder horns and loose balls and wads or anything like that. Who knows? But in the military context, all that stuff is
it's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen because the army is not reliant on individuals doing their own little thing. It has a supply chain, and the ammunition supplied to it comes in a certain form, and it's going to be paper cartridges, and then you need to know how to use those. So again, it has to be contextualized. Did it happen? Oh, sure, it happened. Was it the doctrine of the day? No, it wasn't.
Absolutely not. You get in big trouble.
What were you saying? What were you saying, Jake? A while ago, I couldn't hear you, buddy.
About what? Which part?
Never mind then. We'll keep going.
But I think where a lot of that, because like I was talking about, that was militiamen who were doing that, farmers, as you stated before. And I think a lot of that comes from one source that I found from Miles Standish had wrote a manual on what people had needed to know or drills for defending themselves when they came over to the Americas in the 1620s. And he describes, at first he talks about people need to be bringing a gun of musket caliber, 70 caliber or greater. And he specifically speaks of have a round loaded in the gun, basically. And if you are ever if you're in a spot where you're needing to fire quickly, load from the mouth. So he actually talked about, basically charging and then having a mouthful of, 70, 69 caliber lead balls and then spit one down the barrel. And I found that source too. But that was basically again, it was a bunch of farmers, a bunch of new settlers coming into a new country. And then eventually he just completely dropped the whole idea of a solid shot and went to the idea of swan shot, because he said the enemies we are facing are not wearing armor. Swan shot will work beautifully, basically. Right. So that was the other thing. One of the only other sources I found on that.
Now, I'm interested to know, though, was the detail surrounding that way of loading, was it complete, or did it sort of end with the level of detail that you just said? No, when you say load from the mouth, was that all he said, or did he go on to explain what that meant?
He went into explaining to what that meant, so I can't think of the quote off the top of my head, but basically what he was saying was carry a mouthful of solid round ball, musket balls with you in your mouth whenever you're in this situation. Put a mouthful of those balls and spit them down the barrel. So it didn't really say how many. It didn't go into great detail. Now, the detail was, and I wish Garrett was here because he could explain it a little better because he's studied this a lot more than I did, was that basically you should have at least one man with a firelock, as they claimed at the time, because they were using very early snap haunces and such, and with a group of guys with muskets. So that way you at least have somebody who can shoot right off the bat instead of having a bunch of guys trying to light their match cord in the lantern. Right. But yeah, there was actually a lot of good information, but I remember that specifically talking about loading from the mouth. Right. That one source there. So
and specifically not using the ramrod.
Yes, specifically not using the ramrod, just spitting the ball down the barrel.
Right.
Really?
But then, like I said,
wasn't there a tap loading too? I've heard of something about tap loading.
The tap loading. What was it I found on that? There was a person. Well, it wasn't really a person. It was a Native American thing where they talk about they would drill out the touch holes fairly large on muskets that they'd have, cut them down, and they also loaded from the mouth. Whoops. I don't know if I'm still there, guys.
Yep.
You're still here. You're still
You're
here.
still here.
Oh, okay. I don't know if something popped up there. But Michael Badhand's got a very good video on that where he actually had a French Charleville, and it was cut down to about yay long, basically pistol length. And he was talking about they would take often and pour powder charge down the barrel with the hammer closed, or the frizzen as some people call it, shake it, spit a ball down the barrel, and then try to fire it before the ball rolled out. I was like, yeah, okay.
I couldn't imagine you could do that for very long anyways. The fouling would probably get so bad, just like earlier.
Well, you
Probably
raise a good
something
point,
early.
though, is that it's the instant that the weapon becomes pointed down to any degree,
It starts to roll.
because
It's
if
gonna
that
roll.
ball can roll down to the powder, it can roll out to the muzzle too, can it?
Mm-hmm.
You would think so, yeah. Common sense would dictate that, yes.
But anyhow, going kind of back into the Napoleonic War things, the French column.
Right.
Can you tell us about dealing with the French column?
The diagram that's always used is a French battalion and a British battalion
Mm-hmm.
in isolation.
Yep.
And to sort of to prove the point of the superiority of a line versus a column and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
The French way was well, I would say more nuanced, but it comes out of the Revolutionary War, like the French Revolutionary Wars of the 1790s.
Mm-hmm.
And they formed mass conscript armies. And they basically, it was called the levée en masse. And that they would create this army, and they would train it on the march. That they would form it in this part of the country, and then everyone would start converging on the chosen point. And as the armies and the parts of the army are moving towards that concentration point, or towards the front, or wherever sort of area they need to go, that they're actually being the those who have newly been either conscripted or joined are being trained on the march. There's no depot; they don't go off and get some sort of basic training or anything like that.
Yeah.
But especially in those early years, there's very little capacity for high levels of training across the army. So what they end up gravitating towards is the bulk of the army being this levée en masse, this sort of quasi-trained, revolutionary, inspired people who are exceptionally well motivated, but undisciplined. They haven't been, serving in a military context to the degree that they are what would normally be considered.
So quantity more than quality?
Absolutely.
Yep.
But then the training sort of gets concentrated in the French light infantry arm, because it's those light infantrymen, the voltigeurs, who are out in front of this essential sort of mass of soldiery, that they need some training. And that's where the French sort of superiority in light infantry comes from.
That would make sense. I mean, out of necessity, you would want to be the best trained if you're going to be the first person to hit the battlefield.
Right. And they adopt larger numbers of that type of soldier than perhaps other armies do. And that's why we mentioned earlier is the British coming out of that era, the 1790s, and fighting the French in various parts during and just after the French Revolution. They realized, the French, there's so many light infantrymen out there, and we can't match them in that, what do they call it? Like the Le Petit Guerre, the small war in between. And so that's where this 1800 sort of paradigm shift begins and comes from. So that's sort of the way that the French go with it. And it obviously over the years, the army becomes more professional, and that revolutionary era army kind of coalesces into, ultimately
the Grand Army,
like the Grand Army that marches into Russia, right?
Yep.
So huge, well-trained, well-motivated, like the pinnacle of its existence is that moment in terms of its cohesion and everything. But that whole column piece sort of comes out of that, because you can't have these conscripts in the early years, like making any kind of linear formation and expecting them to stay dressed off and keep the army, or even the division or that section of the army in line, so that you can meet the enemy in the way you want. It's literally this kind of, you can herd them towards, and you herd them towards that critical point with their mass and their velocity, their inertia, their impetus. But then you cover them with a whole mass of light infantrymen who have been, if you have only a limited amount of training hours to put towards your army, let's put them towards them, train them like that, and they can do the bulk of the fighting, as it were, to get this big mass of people behind them close enough that they can literally just stampede up to and shatter the enemy in front of them. And that's, generally speaking, the sort of the French way. And that's where this whole column thing comes into context. There's some really famous, there's lots of examples. And that's why, of course, Wellington mentioned later on after Waterloo, they came on in the same old way, and we beat them in the same old way.
Yep.
But it has to be said that that's the British context, but the French fought the Austrians, they fought the Prussians, they fought the Russians. You know, I mean, on and on and on. It went, and
it is an interesting tactic because, I mean, in one way you'd think that would work really well, but then in another way, if you knew how to fight against it, you could defeat it.
Right. And that's, as we mentioned again earlier, is that where the British light infantry arm sort of comes out of, and they start to match the French in the light infantry capability, and ultimately, especially in that,
they can defeat it.
Actually, he talks about having, they ultimately beat them at that game, and
that's pretty interesting.
But like at Waterloo, there's the corps commanded by General D'Erlon, and launches a big attack sort of on the right of the Allied, with the left of the Allied center, the right of the French center. And there's famously 4 divisions in divisional columns. And that means each battalion, there was 8 or 9 battalions in each division, and each battalion is in line. So 500, 800 men in 3 ranks as the French fought. And each battalion is in line. So there's 8 of those groupings, one behind the other. Right. And then there's 4 of those groupings side by side. And so they're so closely packed. There's no room, there's no intent to deploy into line of any kind. They just, covered by their voltigeurs out front, they just march up the hill and ultimately get stopped at the top of the hill and then get counterattacked by the British cavalry, and they send them all the way back to where they started from. But if you're interested, and it's obviously quite ever seen that?
Water. Okay.
So it's written by here we go, Mark Adkin. This guy writes incredible books.
Okay.
And I'll just, if you bear with me for a quick sec,
you're fine,
because his book is full of. I'll try and find the chapter on the attack of D'Erlon, because he like graphically illustrates what the division looked like. At the one of 4, of course. Where are we here?
I'm jealous of your book collection, Rob. You got a nice one, man.
No, not there yet. I'm getting close. But I mean, just I come across it and I'll show you. I mean, there's his graphic representation of a British battalion in line.
Okay.
Right. But
yeah,
interestingly enough, and it's common sort of knowledge as well, like there's a British battalion in column.
Yep.
Because column was the way you maneuvered. Right.
Yeah.
And then you deployed into line after, either for defense or attack. So, here we wait, where are we? There we are. So there's a French in a column of attack.
Yep.
Which is a French battalion with 6 companies, and as you can see, the 6 there, and then as we move across. Sorry, here, hold on. This solid block of blue you can see is a representation of one of the divisions of D'Erlon at that attack. So, I mean, literally all those battalions in line behind one another at very, very close distance.
I just feel like that would be asking to be an artillery target.
That too.
And the sort of the saving grace was the fact that the British just didn't have the kind of massing of artillery that the French did.
Yeah.
But they suffered grievously going up that slope.
Yeah.
But, then again, they're not attacking in isolation. There's masses of light infantrymen in front of them that are being met by the British light infantry coming up the hill. They're being fired at on the French left flank from the light infantry troops and the riflemen that are stationed at La Haye Sainte and the Sandpit. So,
Okay.
they are really, but as you might imagine, when you look at that diagram, that's something that you basically form it up and you aim it and you shoot it.
Yeah.
And because you
hopefully it
send
breaks
on its
through.
way, it's not changing direction. It's not redeploying into anything else. It's going to start when it starts, and it's going to get there and hopefully win whatever you sent it to go and do. So
just drive right through.
exactly. There's no nuance there. It's just a big fist. And you've got 4 of those in line with each other, side by side, marching up the slope. And it's met by British battalions at the top of the hill in 2 ranks. The Gordon Highlanders there, the Black Watch are there. I think the 33rd is there, and a number of other ones, which stalls them. And in that moment at the top of the hill, when those front ranks of that leading battalion, start taking fire, and they stumble a little bit, and then the people at the back have no idea what's going on, and they keep marching, and then they're bumping into the people in front. Things become a little, less cohesive. And then at that moment, 2 brigades of British cavalry come thundering over the hill and start cutting into you, right?
Yeah.
And there's been no preparation for that cavalry, in terms of forming a nice tight mass to repel it. And famously, then the British cavalry chase and cut them up all the way back to their starting point, get through the French guns, and then get themselves charged by French cavalry, and they're basically done for the rest of the battle. That's
until the Prussians show up.
In a nutshell, that's why Wellington was never confident of his cavalry, because they charged at everything, and then they were gone. They were completely ineffective after that. They might have done something when they charged, but then you could never get them back, or they charged at the wrong moment or anything like that. So, when we talk about that column versus line thing, famously Napoleon actually had a tactic he called mixed order. And that was in a brigade, or what did they call them back earlier on? It was like a demi brigade or something. The French went through a big doctrine change after the revolution and got rid of old terminology and brought in new terminology. And then once the empire kind of solidified, they went back to the old terminology. But they would have battalions in column, like that attack column I showed you earlier, the 6 companies, 2 up with 2 companies wide by 3 companies deep. They would form those, and then in between those, they'd have a battalion in line. The overall concept is that, and the frontage of that entire brigade or division attacking that way would have met whatever frontage of battalions and brigades they were facing. So you're telling me that in that sense, that those columns were defeated by a line, but the frontage was occupied by the same, density. Well, perhaps more density on the French side, but it wasn't like it was a lone column against a lone battalion. It was a number of them all lined up together, fighting another bunch of battalions. So there's a bit of nuance that has to go with that, I think. And a lot of it comes just with the tactical, reality at the moment. The guard at the end of Waterloo attacks up the slope famously. And Adkin actually talks about, well, they were probably advancing in square. Because of what had happened earlier in the day. They didn't want to get caught by cavalry making their attack. So they actually advanced up the slope, and being the old guard, they perhaps could be relied on to maintain that quite difficult formation to march in. But they went up the hill in square. So, I mean, that's not really an attack formation per se, but they chose that because of the threat of cavalry, and they got to the top of the hill, and they then attempted to deploy once they got and saw that the British were there, which essentially surprised them. And then they faltered, and essentially they got flanked. The battalions on their left or the British right kind of marched forward and hooked around the flank of this body of French troops who were formed in sort of individual battalion squares. And it just that moment, and they were unable to sort of stick to their guns, as it were, no pun intended. And they ended up, obviously, that was the
panicked and
battle, and it was over after, right?
So you talked about British cavalry and Wellington not being fully I can't think of the word, but fully trusting in their abilities. Is that a usual thing with the British Army? Like, would that be a thing you'd see in the Revolutionary War? Were they very quick to attack?
Yeah.
Because I can think of one battle in particular. It's coming to my mind in the Revolutionary War, Battle of Cowpens, which I'm sure you're fairly familiar with.
I certainly know the name and whatnot. I can't claim to any kind of great understanding of. I could probably find a book on it and learn it, but off the top of my head, not right. But I know the name, and I know that it was fairly significant. Yeah.
It's basically it was the turning point that nobody wants to talk about. But basically, what happens is Tarleton, Bannister Tarleton. He's a British, I believe. Yeah, he was a colonel at this time. He is supposed to sit here and wait for Cornwallis to join him. Cornwallis is off to the north waiting for Patrick Ferguson to bring all of the Tory volunteers to join him. Problem is Ferguson is obviously never going to join up with him because Ferguson is lying dead up on King's Mountain. So Cornwallis is basically sitting over here waiting for something that's never going to happen. Tarleton is in charge. He's supposed to be just kind of watching and seeing what's going on. He gets a burr under his saddle, basically. He sees a big line of American militia on a ridgeline, and he thinks, well, that's easy target for my dragoons. I could send my dragoons right through there, and I could smash right through the middle of them and send them running. It's militia. And, of course, he had riflemen, Morgan's riflemen, actually stationed out amongst the in the battlefield, kind of picking off, harassing, and breaking morale. But what happens is they send in Tarleton sends in his full line, basically up the side of this ridge line, and sends his dragoons in, and they engage Morgan's riflemen. Of course, they break. They're shooting rifles. They're not in any way meant to engage against musket fire at close range. They break. They fall back in with the militia. So then the line of British regulars, militia, coming up against each other. The militia fire 2 rounds, and then they start running. They start breaking, and they are legitimately panicking, even though they were told they were supposed to fire 2 rounds and run. Tarleton sees this, immediately sends everybody running up over the hill. The line actually breaks formation, charges up over this hill, and that's where they find the regulars on the other side of the hill. And Cornwallis was not happy whenever he found out about this. Basically, that is where he was facing Daniel Morgan, I believe. Daniel Morgan, Francis Marion, and the third one is, I want to say Henry Lighthorse. But basically, he's facing this very large group of regulars because his cavalry had broken through and basically done what you talked about at Waterloo. They didn't sense the situation very well before they went in there. So I was just wondering if you can think of any other instances of British cavalry kind of doing that.
I don't know if those two are really sort of tactically similar. Wellington was sort of guarded in his praise, in the sense that they were well mounted and well trained, like appointed, but their discipline in attack was not what he wanted. He wanted attacks to be made and then reform and then come back into reserve for the next time.
Okay,
and that often became not the case. Running around charging at everything is a phrase that gets used in that context from time to time. Yeah. I think the Tarleton example you gave, I mean, quite frankly, tactically, if you understand a situation to the best of your understanding, in the sense that that's what I'm looking, there's the enemy and they're breaking and running, and I have mounted men at my disposal. Quite frankly, that's what mounted men are for, is when the army breaks or the enemy breaks, then you get them in there, because now they're not formed and they're running away, and you can cut them up a bit. And you've got the mobility aspect with your horses, and you can catch them. So, I mean, to say that was an example of bad discipline or on the part of the cavalry specifically, I don't know if that is the case. Was Tarleton which not hesitant, but was he premature in sending them there in the first place, which would point to his personal decision being maybe incorrect or not perhaps done with the utmost of knowledge that should have been there in the first place. But if that cavalry had done what they were intended to do, which is run out the hill, chase the militia away, cut them up a bit, and then wait or withdraw and reform. And what they ended up doing was going off on a tangent somewhere because they saw the baggage train and they went and looted the baggage train when they precisely at the moment where they were needed to reform and attack the right instead of the left. That would be an example of bad discipline. But I don't know if that necessarily would be the case that you just laid out at Cowpens in terms of being over the hill, finding the mass of the American regular forces present, and then basically running into trouble because of that, right?
Yeah. So another thing I forgot to mention is the night prior, none of his men slept. Like he kept his men going all night because they were chasing what he thought was the main body, and I can't remember which one it was. But basically, there was the river running through that area. They were trying to find a spot to cross, and he sent his guys up away to go plot a crossing, and it wasn't the actual one they were going to use. And he wore his men out, and I think that kind of played into a lot of why they were like, "Oh, they're running. Of course, we're just gonna take out after them."
Right.
But my thought was what I kind of wondered why he didn't do is he had light cavalry, why, and he sees the lines breaking. Of course, he's going to charge right in there. But you think you might have sent some of that light cavalry around to kind of do what they're supposed to do and scout around that ridge line and see, maybe what's just back there.
Yeah. I again, to say that the tactical decisions made at the moment are all obviously his assessment of what's going on is based on every single action he's fought against the Americans up until that point and their behavior before that. And, he made decisions based on what he thought was perhaps the right thing to do.
And that's exactly what he ran up to.
Everybody's tactical nuance comes from their own experience. Oh yeah, I've seen this before. Or you know what? Those guys in the red hats, those guys tend to do this. And guess what? They're doing that. And I know when they do that, that's what it means, and I can exploit that. And so let's do this. Let's do our thing now because they're at vulnerable point, whatever it is. But that's where that comes from. And oftentimes I know that whether it's the British Army fighting the Zulus in the 1870s, and this kind of they ought to have known better. They made bad decisions. They did. Yeah. But so much of that tactical paradigm comes from
hindsight.
Previous engagement.
In the case of the Zulu War, they weren't fighting the Zulus before, but they were fighting other tribes in Southern Africa, and everything they were doing and all the tactics they were using worked fine. Right, and the firepower that they were able to bring to bear was sufficient, and more so. Yet when it comes to facing the Zulu, now there's all this because of the disaster. Now all the navel gazing happens, and the judgment, and the you should have done this part. It all comes into play. So to say that should Tarleton have done what he did, or he should have done something different? Well, maybe what he did was perfectly feasible based on his own experience in fighting the Americans. Right? That there's a militia, there they are, they're running away, chase them down and cut them up.
Oh yeah, it makes perfect sense because at that point, that's all he'd really dealt with. That's
all they do
is when you see militia, they break.
and correct me if I'm wrong. Tarleton's Legion was certainly it wasn't a it was a formed body. It was a grouping of the army, but it was sort of this sort of informal, not unofficial. What's the word I'm looking for?
He had a lot of Tory help.
Right, but I mean, it wasn't a formed body of regular soldiers, right? His legion had a number of aspects to it, and it was more like like the Jeb Stuart kind of model.
Yeah,
able to roam and rampage at times.
Oh yeah,
right.
Harass. Yes,
right, harass, and so his style of warfare, all the countless little actions that he fought in, would have led him perhaps, and I'm just postulating here. I'm not, telling you how it is or anybody else for that matter, but in the context of the story as was just laid out, maybe that he thought that was exactly what needs to happen. And the 3 times he did that before, it worked every time.
Yeah.
But this time he was caught by a four
didn't
body
work.
regulars behind the hill. And I mean,
Yep.
to say that and just sort of brush it off, but to say that he was completely wrong and he was ineffective. Well, wait a minute. Let's just
Yeah.
look at the broader picture a little bit.
Mhm.
And did he make a mistake? Okay, he made a mistake,
yeah.
and it cost him the battle. Okay, well, that tends to happen from time to time, right?
Yep.
It seems
yeah.
to me that cavalry officers are a little bit.
They're different anyway.
They're a little
Yeah.
free-spirited. You know, you just made the Jeb Stuart comparison, and I was thinking the same thing when
Yep.
you guys first started talking about Tarleton doing that. You know, and I think you could probably throw Custer in there too.
A little bit.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, really, when you think about it, that's their job, is to be that hammer. Like you're talking about. Basically, if you can, hit them in the flank. So, but you can, especially you talking about heavy cavalry like cuirassiers or whatever. You know, I was talking to Garrett about this the other day. I was like, linear warfare is not near. Everybody says, "Oh, it's just stupid. People were just doing it because it was the gentlemanly way of fighting." No, it was. There were all sorts of perks to it, basically. And I don't know if you guys have ever heard of there's a game we used to play as kids called Red Rover. Basically, everybody links arms, and you send one guy to try to break through the line. And if you break through the line, you win or whatever. I said, linear combat is like the world's biggest, deadliest game of Red Rover. And you got that one kid that's 300 pounds and 6'2". That's like your cuirassiers. That's your real hard hitter, or like you're talking about the French column. Their job is to break through. And I think that is what Tarleton was thinking. Oh, I'm the fist. I can smash right through here. But, it didn't work out too well for him. And like you were saying, he obviously had a very successful run up to this point. I don't think he'd been beat until that point. So, yeah, just one instance of a mistake that led down to a little bit of a downfall.
For sure.
Let's see here. Yeah, well,
while we're pausing, I'm just give me a sec here. I'm going to try and find those books because I know they're around somewhere.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. We might run for a little bit longer, guys, here, and we'll probably think about closing her down because I'm going to have to put my kids to sleep.
Oh, we haven't talked about mini rifles or the Crimean War or nothing.
God.
Oh, the
I was hoping
Crimean
to talk
War.
about
That is where I know
the Martini Henry a little, get into.
Yeah, tell us about the Crimean War. Just talk to us, Rob, for a little bit about the Crimean War. I know you're itching at the bit to do that.
Well, yeah, it's that's another sort of real paradigm shift. In a number of ways. I would say that the in terms of the pointy end stuff, certainly. Everyone's read Brett Gibbons' book. Everyone knows Brett Gibbons.
Yeah, I read his
name's
book,
familiar.
The Destroying Angel.
Yeah. So he's got now. There's the Destroying Angel. There's the English cartridge, and he's done one on what did he call it? It's on gunpowder, which might be interesting to you, Jake.
I've read both of them. I haven't read the English cartridge yet.
Okay. So obviously that one deals more with the actual complete ammunition. He talks a little bit about powder in there. Anyway, those are, very well written and very, admittedly somewhat niche topics, but certainly taken in a greater context, really draw attention to a very important, time, certainly not only just within the British Army, but in sort of worldwide as well, right? Mm-hmm. So the British Army going into the Crimea is called the Army of the East, and for the reason that it ends up going there to the Crimea, it makes a stop in Turkey, and then it makes a stop in Bulgaria, on the Danube, and then sets across the Black Sea again ends up in the Crimea, which is where the naval base of the Russians is. And on the way there, up until just weeks before the army set sail or embarks to set sail to the east, the army's armed with essentially the same weaponry that the army at Waterloo used, with the exception being that flintlocks have been replaced by percussion locks. But in terms of capability on the battlefield, as I'm sure most of you have used both, a properly tuned and attended to flintlock is quite reliable, except perhaps in the pouring rain. Whereas a percussion cap is just more reliable, right? In firing that that round in bad weather, whether it's bad because of rain or just heavy dew or snow or whatever. But interestingly enough, there are huge problems with misfires in the Battle of Inkerman in particular, which is one of the major battles fought by the British during the Crimean Wars, particularly the early part. So that's right up at the beginning, before the army leaves. It's armed with percussion smoothbore muskets and the rifles. There's 2 battalions of riflemen that are tasked with joining the various divisions, forming the army, and they're armed with the Brunswick, which is the replacement rifle for the Baker. Mm-hmm. And right before they embark, this relatively new rifle, which has been tested only in small numbers in South Africa in the couple of years previous to see its suitability, which is based on this Minier principle of expanding ball. I say principle because there's, as Brett very succinctly lays it out, is that there are a whole bunch of people, Delvigne, Minier, Metford, and Hague, in the whole continuum of ammunition in the British context, they all have their role to play. But that bullet-shaped bullet rather than a round ball with a hollow base, the intent is for that to expand into a rifling and therefore stabilize the bullet on the way downrange. The P51 Minier rifle is used, as they say, in South Africa for the first time in 52 in some of the frontier actions fought down there. And it's literally, we've got this new rifle, let's send it to what's happening right now. And that's what's happening right now and across the empire. Get it there. Let's see how it performs in the bush. And from all intents and purposes, it's very promising. The Eastern question rises, and they decide, and they've got, we talked earlier about that whole, the number of the year of the adoption of a weapon doesn't mean that it's in the hands of the troops at that time at all. So the Minier rifle is issued to the Army of the East, and that's the first place it goes in the entire army because it's the main effort of the entire British Empire at that point. In the year they embark, which is 1854. So that's the 1851 rifle being issued first time in large numbers in 1854. And literally the training on it needs to be developed, which is done by a number of commanders, Campbell in particular. On the way there, they're like, "Oh boy, this could be a game changer. How far does this thing shoot? What? What does that go to? 1,000 yards?" Up until this point, a Brunswick is sighted to 300, and a percussion musket, whether it be a 39 pattern or a 42 pattern, are sighted to, sort of 100 because it's a fixed sight, and it's meant to just help you and aid you in those engagements sub 200 yards. So now this thing will shoot 1,000 yards, and am I going to hit what I'm looking at 1,000? No, you're not. But,
no.
But that French column or that Russian column that is 100 yards wide and 200 yards deep, you might hit somebody in there.
You will hit something,
right?
You'll hit something.
So that's the context of this paradigm shift. And the shorter the range gets, the more precise the weapon can be, and the individual becomes capable of hitting another individual, but at far greater ranges than they were ever able to before. And of the 5 divisions that go to the east, all but 1 is issued the Minier rifle. Whether the rifle battalions, there's 2 of which that I think it's the 3rd and the 4th division, each have a battalion extra. A division at the time is 6 battalions, and there's an extra battalion of riflemen attached to 2 of those divisions. But they get the Minier rifle, and the rest of the infantry get the Minier rifle. And what ends up happening is, although the war is fought very much in the same Napoleonic context on both sides, Russians relying more on mass and momentum and denser sort of column-driven formations, and the British relying, as they have since the American Revolution, on a 2-rank line for fighting. But that column, as I showed you in the book, with the companies sort of lined up behind each other in varying spacings, they use that for maneuver. So if the battalion's got to get to the top of the hill, they'll march there in column and then deploy into line and to defend that hill or whatnot. And if they need to attack that hill, they'll march to the beginning of the attack and deploy into line and then march in line in the attack. So that's what happens at the Elma, which is the first major battle of the war. And it's, I mean, you look at the accounts and how the battalions maneuvered and the way they attacked. It's Napoleonic. They're marching shoulder to shoulder and delivering their fire, which becomes very apparent that it's quite effective against dug-in Russians. So there's not a lot of nuance that you can do there when the Russians are dug in behind redoubts and all that kind of stuff. They fight the Battle of the Alma, and then the Russians withdraw, and they don't withdraw right back to Sevastopol. They withdraw into the interior, and a lot of the forces from Sevastopol leave Sevastopol because they don't want to get trapped there because they see what's going on, and they're like, we don't want to all be in Sevastopol and be besieged. So let's get into the interior of the Crimea where we can at least maintain our ability to maneuver and see how it goes. And that's what they end up doing, leaving a large but not overall proportionally huge part of their army in Sevastopol. And the British and the French march down and they besiege Sevastopol, which is very poorly executed. And the Russians are able to supply and move material and guns and men in and out of Sevastopol for the entire siege. They have the freedom to do that because the siege lines don't completely cut the city off, which is like, isn't that Siege 101? But anyway, that's why the war lasts 3 years, right? 54, 55, 56. And ultimately, though, once the British and the French besiege Sevastopol, the Russians try a number of times to break the siege. And they try first at the Battle of Balaclava, when that interior army comes to the flank, and they try and go for the British supply base at Balaclava. They're not successful, but they're partially successful. And during that battle, which is not particularly infantry heavy, it's more about the taking of some redoubts that are manned by Turks, and then obviously the very famous cavalry actions, the charge of the Light Brigade, which everyone knows about, and the disaster that befalls those 6 regiments. Or 5 regiments, 5, 6, 5. And then the little known but much more successful and decisive charge of the Heavy Brigade, which is another 5 regiments of heavy cavalry, which at that point there's no real distinguishment. They have different uniforms. They all are carrying the same sword in theory. So there's not really much in the way. I mean, you look at how the Light Brigade met its demise, doing what essentially is heavy cavalry work, right? Charging guns. Right? Light cavalry work is that flank maneuver, the screening, the skirmishing, the gaining of reconnaissance information. That's light cavalry work. But in this case, because there really is no difference in cavalry at that point, and the same goes for the infantry as well. Although there's all kinds of regiments of light infantry and rifles, all infantry by the time of the Crimea is trained to one degree or another in light infantry work. And we see this come after Balaclava. The stand of the 93rd is an infantry action fought by a battalion with some attachments against Russian cavalry. They engage them at 600 yards, which is unheard of up until that moment in particular British military history, but arguably in military history period. That cavalry attacking infantry might expect in the previous paradigm to be engaged at 100 yards. And so you better be in some sort of square or guard your flanks, because otherwise they'll ride around you and cut you up from behind. But in this case, Campbell says, no, in line, deliver all your firepower at those ranges. And they deliver 2, some say maybe another half volley. And that sends the Russians leaving. They're like, no, we're out of here. Because you can imagine that first volley at 600, with steady infantry, well loaded, waiting. The range has been effective. The sights are set, and the volleys is delivered at battalion level. That's at that point is probably 600, 700. I can't remember what the strength of the 93rd at that battle is, but it's somewhere around there. Because the winter hadn't set in and everyone hadn't died of cholera yet. But there's got to be some effect on a big mass of Russian cavalry, and those people must have been thinking to themselves, they could see the smoke from the discharge way up ahead. And they're like, oh, what are they doing? What are they? All of a sudden, somebody falls next to you, and you can hear the bullet whistling, whizzing by you. Like, what's going on here? I'll keep going. And then 300 yards later, another volley. And it's really noticeable now. Like people are falling and horses are being shot. And wait a minute. Well, if we get another one of those, we're going to be in for it. And so they start veering away. They're like, oh, okay, we're done. And as they veer away, they get another one in their flank.
Yep.
Right. And I mean, the infantry just faced off in line against cavalry and won.
It reminds me of
that cavalry was headed to Balaclava with the intent of taking, as the lead element of the army behind them, that he was intent on taking Balaclava. So, the stand of the 93rd rightfully becomes something of well, obviously it's mythologized, but it is important, but it demonstrates that weapon. And the very next day, the Russians try on the north flank. They come out of Sevastopol and they probe the British siege lines. And the Battle of Little Inkerman is fought, which is a admittedly smaller action, and fought on the day after Balaclava. Again, they're trying to relieve the siege. And at that battle, the Battle of Little Inkerman, a force of between 30 and 50 men who are picked from the Brigade of Guards under the command of Captain Goodlake are selected as sharpshooters, and they fight an action in a gully on the north flank of the British siege lines against greatly outnumbered, but their discipline and their fire, and they withdraw to a bit of a barricade across the bottom of this gully, and they hold off the Russians. Interestingly enough, not before the captain and one of his sergeants who are probing forward down the gully are hiding in a cave and get surrounded inadvertently by Russians. And then they have to break out. And basically one of those moments on a battlefield where no one knows they're there, but the fact that they leap out, they shoot somebody, punch someone in the face, and then they start running to beat hell back to their own lines, and no one understands what just happened, and they're able to escape, like pushing past a bunch of Russians, and they get back to their own lines. Anyway, he ends up winning the Victoria Cross for his action on that day. Again, his sharpshooters armed with the mini rifle, the power, the accuracy that you can get from something like that is beginning to sort of manifest itself, right? In battle in general. And then a week or so later, just a bit more than a week, on the 5th of November, the Russians develop that little action, the Little Inkerman, and they come in force from both the interior and Sevastopol, and they attack in huge numbers on the Inkerman Heights. And that battle is fought in a most desperate fashion by nothing more than a battalion at a time formed together. There's a couple of instances where the battalions attack together in line, in two ranks, shoulder to shoulder, forward with the bayonet. But the rest of the battle and the dozens of battalions that end up being involved fight in penny packets, in half battalions, in wings, in companies. And when the action gets hot and heavy and the smoke's there and the mist is there and the confusion and the noise, they are fighting in smaller groups than that. And they're extending themselves to try and hold off huge masses of Russians with basically nobody, because the numbers of British that are being able to brought to bear at any given time are very small. But the effect of the Minier rifle is telling. The fire is accurate, and it's devastating. It's a huge bullet. It's 700 some odd grains, and it's flying accurately now. It's not a smoothbore round ball. And it is, if it goes through somebody's arm, it's definitely going into the guy behind you.
Yep.
It's even going through people into those behind. So the effect, we talked earlier about some sort of force multiplier. That is definitely what the Minier rifle brings to the battlefield. And it begins
100%
this ascendancy in the Crimea. And that gets developed throughout the rest of the 1850s in India during the mutiny, when the Minier, or what then replaces the Minier rifle, which is the P-53, which comes into service first time issued in 1855. And that's in the Crimea. But obviously it takes a lot longer for the whole army to get equipped and re-equipped, because the Minier rifle never equips the whole army. After the Crimea, the P-53 comes in, and it becomes the main service arm. And that Minier rifle is only used in the Crimea, essentially, and then goes into stores once the P-53 comes into service. But apart from the Army of the East in the Crimea, the rest of the British Army still have smoothbores up until they finally get the P-53.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so the Army in Britain has smoothbores. A large parts of the Army in India still have smoothbores. So we end up with this sort of ascendancy of the rifle musket, which has obvious implications during the American Civil War, but that's a huge other topic. But one very interesting, especially when the nuance of how it's used and its effect on the battlefield gets explored, of which Brett does a great job.
Yeah. So you're talking about the Russians basically advancing, and you see a guy falling next to you, and you're like, where's this coming from? I couldn't help but think of the story about American Civil War, of course, talking about a lot of British weapons coming over, especially into the Confederacy, of General Sedgwick, where he had his guys are basically, which is funny because we have Sedgwick County, Kansas down here. It's actually named after him. Union General has all these guys are ducking for cover, and he comes out there, and I think the exact words were, all of you ducking, because they were getting fired at from sharpshooters. And what he didn't realize is these sharpshooters are using Whitworths. And so he says, all you boys ducking from a bullet or two whizzing by your ears from a Confederate sharpshooter. A Confederate sharpshooter couldn't hit an elephant at this. And that's as far as he got because he automatically got smacked right there.
Right. I know it's a very famous story, and it's always used for the whole Whitworth piece, right?
Yeah.
That it often gets put in the spot of like a sniper. That there's one shot, one kill. But you made a very good observation, is that they were under fire.
Yeah.
and all that fire beforehand hadn't hit him.
Yep.
At that very moment, he was saying, "Look at all what's going on around you. Nothing's hitting us." The one hit him.
And one hit him.
But it's always put in the context of some sort of deliberate thing that, it was sort of eat that. And there you go. And that Whitworth.
No.
But
it was definitely, there's a guy on a horse.
Well, sure. But the point being is that guy who shot him had shot at him 5 times already.
Yeah. He was just waiting for him to say that before he got him.
Right. But the context of the legend is never that.
Yeah.
Right?
No.
It's that somebody saw him on his horse, took deliberate aim, and shot him with one round, and it hit him just as he was complaining to his men for taking cover because all this stuff is ineffective.
No,
you actually look at even the details of the legend. It proves it disproves the legend in telling it almost.
Yeah.
Right. If you can hear it coming past, it's not hitting. So they're already shooting at you, and you're not hitting you yet.
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 Right.
That one luck, the perfect timing
in the first place.
The perfect timing of speech and just all
Really
the numbers in the universe lining up. Got it.
Terrible bad luck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a common another similar legend with Plunkett and his baker shooting the French general at Cassabellas.
Yeah.
During the retreat to Corona in 1809. And that is I've yet to make the video proper on it. I've mentioned it a few times already. But I've got a file. I've got to find some way to efficiently make a full-size target of a French general on a horse so I can shoot at it at real ranges and whatnot. I've been to Cassabellas, and when you read legends of the internet, people are talking about, he shot him at 800 yards and all this kind of stuff. It's just no, he didn't. Because this rifle is sighted to 300 yards. So you tell me how you can shoot somebody in the head deliberately with a rifle that only shoot this. I mean, you're aiming so far above the target. There's just really no way. But and it was done in an article written by a fellow named Moore, which is available online. If you just Google Rifleman Plunkett, Cassabellas legend or something, you'll come up with it. And it's very well laid out. Assessment of the ground, assessment of the situation, looking at the way the story was told, and it probably somewhere between 200 and maybe at the most 300. In my experience shooting my baker, although I'm certainly not some sort of dead eye, 300 yards is sort of like man size,
it's a distance.
Like maybe.
Yeah.
To turn around and make 2 shots, one in the French general and the other one in his aide. Probably closer than that.
So then, what do you think about the claim in DeWitt Bailey's book by the I can't remember who it was. It was somebody witnessing the shooting of the pattern 1776, and they claimed that at 400 yards he could put, I think he said something like 4 out of 8 rounds into a target the size of the brim of my hat. And DeWitt Bailey was like, "Well, seeing as how that's a 6-inch target at 400 yards, I find that a little hard to believe."
Well, I think because you mentioned that, I think I wrote back to you. Because the
Battle of Adobe Walls.
It's a little bit
also reminds me of.
Because I've got it here. Because I actually, when you read it, or when you sent that quote along, I was thinking to myself, wait a minute.
I
Like
don't
you just
remember.
said, I was like, well,
Yeah.
I'm just trying to remember what it's in the 1776 chapter.
It's like claim
I went and looked at it, and
Yeah.
when you actually look at the quote, it is to a degree a little bit more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
Ferguson. Still Ferguson.
Reminds me of on the story of extraordinary shots, Joseph Plum Martin's book. He claims that they were walking down the road and they saw a redcoat picking apples, and one of the soldiers asked if he could fire at the redcoat, and the officer said yes, and the exact quote was, "As I live and breathe," he hit the redcoat, and the shot was over a mile away. I was like, with a musket? Okay, yeah, this is a little hard to believe now.
I found it. I found it here. I'll
Okay.
read it out.
Yeah.
It says the gun manufactory is pretty. The forging, scraping, and boring please me much. The rifle guns are handsome, pretty pieces. 800 are nearly finished on government account at £3, 3 shillings each. A gentleman with one of them at a distance of 150 yards shot a ball 6 times out of 8 within the circumference of the crown of my hat.
Okay, 150 yards.
Semicolon.
Okay, that's believable.
Yeah, semicolon.
Yeah.
At 400 yards, he shot within half a yard of the mark.
Okay. All
Okay.
right, so I got those two mixed up.
That's reasonable.
Half a yard.
I'd
So
call
he was
that
making
reasonable.
a 36-inch group with something comparable to 6 or 8 rounds at 400 yards.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
the exact quote.
So
It's not speaking of muzzle loadings per se, but the Battle of Adobe Walls is one of the all-time favorite long shots ever in a fight. It was a mountain ridge or a hill ridge in Texas, and he shoots it's a buffalo rifle, and he knocks an Indian off his horse, and it was something like a mile.
It is 900 something yards supposedly.
Yeah, it was crazy distances, and he even said that it was a pure luck shot. He just hit it. And there's actually a competition,
like a high wall or a rolling block or a sharps or something.
I want to say it was a sharp.
think
No,
it's
it
a
wasn't a sharp.
Sharps.
What was it?
Where's Garrett? He would know.
He would know. Garrett would know.
I mean,
It was something like a sharps.
Or certainly, what year was that?
That was 1870s.
Right. So I mean, those rifles are
870.
capable of shooting that far. Like a 45-70 will shoot that far.
Oh yeah.
Oh, here come the comments.
This was something like the comments are definitely going to know.
90.
50-90.
90.
No, 50-90. So I mean,
Yeah, huge.
they're capable of shooting that far, right?
Oh yeah.
You know, I mean, how far did you do? 900 yards?
I believe it was around 900 yards, close to a mile, something like that.
Wall at 900 yards.
Doug Duke says it was a 50.
He was up on top of a hill.
Oh, top of a hill.
The guy was on top of a hill, so
Still, it's 900 yards away.
yeah.
Like, maybe you can see that he's there, but
But you're not gonna, he even said it was a luck shot. He just kind of aimed in that direction, guessed, pulled the trigger, and he saw the guy fall off his horse.
right.
What rifle?
And
was
they
it?
actually,
There's
it was a
Landon
sharps,
now.
right?
What kind of
But,
rifles use Adobe Walls? For
They
the
have this
long shot?
competition every year. You can actually go and do the shoot. It's kind of a neat thing.
Well, neat. And whereabouts is that?
It's in Texas. Where is that actually at in Texas? You guys know?
It's in the Panhandle because I've been there before. There's literally nothing left.
I forgot the name
but
of the town
I can tell
itself.
you this: it's not too far from a place called Fritch. Fritch, Texas, kind of out by Amarillo. But there's nothing there anymore, and you can just see, for miles.
And there were 2 battles in the exact same place. They had the first battle of Adobe Walls and the second battle of Adobe Walls. It happened during the second battle of Adobe Walls. And it was basically a bunch of buffalo hunters that got run down on by a bunch of Indians, and they fought both times. Kit Carson was in the first one, I believe. Yeah, he was at the first one. Somebody will correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure.
I think he was. I don't know. Oh, we might run for a little bit longer here, and we'll probably have to call her a night. But it's been a pretty good chat, though. But no, talking about that DeWitt Bailey book, the trial of the American long rifle versus the pattern 1776. I wish I could find some more information about that, because I know he even states in the book, he's just like, there's nobody ever talked about what happened after that. So what do you think? There really wasn't any, there was so much little of a difference that it didn't matter, that they didn't even write about it, or it just got lost in time, or lost to time?
Well, what's the context of the fighting? What's the sort of the kind of ground around it?
Yeah.
I mean,
does this matter?
Quite frankly, why is the if we use a sort of a modern kind of context, why is the M4 short?
Mm-hmm.
Why did the U.S. Army go from an M16 to an M4?
Yeah,
we weren't shooting at long distance that much. Shorter.
Yeah. It's shorter. It's handier in the back of a vehicle.
Yeah,
whatever the reasons
all
are.
of it. Shorter carbine was all around better.
Any number of things.
And if you needed distance, we'll just get a different weapon.
All things being equal, what's the better weapon in the bush?
Yeah,
1776 or a Jaeger, or an American long rifle, which is like 8 feet long.
That's what I was about to say. Probably, I'm gonna go with probably the 1776 just because it's so short.
Well, it's handier, right? And I mean, are you looking to shoot? Well, first of all, a round ball rifle just will not perform at excessive ranges.
Yeah.
So any ranges of the time are going to be like 300 yards is going to be that's way long.
Yeah.
Right in the air of the smoothbore musket.
Most forested areas you couldn't even see that far, would you? I mean, like thinking about it.
Get to, right, is the terms of the terrain you're using.
The terrain, you might not even need it. Yeah.
Like unless you're hunting, if you're hunting in the woods, you're going to hit a deer like under 100.
100 usually, yeah.
So if you're fighting in that kind of environment, those kinds of ranges are going to be what you end up with. So does the long rifle have an advantage at those extreme ranges? I don't know. A long rifle will also be typically 45, 40 caliber, somewhere around there.
Yeah. Well, I got this one here, which this one's a 50 caliber.
50.
It's based off of a rifle that was made in the 1760s, but they shortened it down to, because evidently there was a thing in the 70s, they started shortening them down a little bit. But I mean, still, even though this thing's short, it's it's long, and it's not
how much shorter is it than the Southern Mountain Rifle?
Garrett, hand me your Southern Mountain Rifle. It's considerably shorter in that Southern Mountain Rifle. Yeah. But it's like you're saying, it's
because those things
50,
are 8 feet
45
long.
Caliber.
I know. Of course, I was joking when I said that, but when you compare them to the 1776 or a Baker, they're obviously very long.
Yeah. So you got the Woods Runner, which is shorter, and then you got this, which is based on an 1830 style rifle, and it goes, and it goes, and it goes, and there's the end. So yeah, that thing's I think it's about 5.5 feet long, something like that.
I know that the Vegas Antique Show, they had one, I swear to God, it was 10 feet long. Like, no joke. It was tall enough that you had to turn it to get it through the door when you're walking through the doors. It was insane.
I've got a Egyptian dog lock. I don't know when it was made, but it's a Michelet style dog lock, 80 caliber smoothbore, and it's about 6'4". So, yeah, it's a big gun.
I don't even know how they rammed that gun. The one I was looking at, I was like, how do you even ram the like? You'd have to push it up against a tree or something. The rifle, but it was ridiculous.
Yeah, like you're saying though, I just think that was probably the result of the test. That pattern 1776 is shorter. It's got a captive rammer, which is very nice. Yeah. Probably won
I mean,
that test.
obviously the rifle was already produced, and they just were sort of having a competition, perhaps, or as you say, some sort of trials to see. But I mean, they obviously went with that because that was the tradition where it came from, which is the Germanic tradition. And their rifles were generally short and handy in sort of woods and bushland and whatnot. And to me, I mean, that makes sense. That's if you want light infantry or riflemen who are going to be acting in that role, that's the kind of rifle you'd want them to have.
Yeah.
Kind of funny to think that they even did that with the pistols. Like my C service is the 1805 pattern, and it is dramatically shorter than the normal one.
Right.
Dramatically shorter.
I got a copy of the land pattern, and it's to the original length, but it's that long for the original 1738 or 28. Yeah, 1728 land pattern.
Right.
When I bought that one, I actually thought it was a cut down one, but thank God it wasn't.
They shortened them pretty considerably.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that was the actual definition of the test, was they were trying to see if there was enough of a difference to make a difference. I think was what they basically boiled down to.
Mm-hmm. And like you say in that quote, he was shooting at the, we'd call it 8-inch circle or so at 150 yards. And excuse me, hitting
That's
6 out of 8.
And,
and then attempting to shoot at 400 and hitting within 36 inches. Well, that's pretty mad.
That's not big. Yeah.
Yep.
And if you put 2 or 3 people standing together, you're going to hit somebody.
Oh yeah.
I mean, and that's at 400 yards that's excessive ranges.
Yeah. And
it's
you usually can't see a person at that distance.
Those are excessive ranges up until, the Crimea.
Yeah.
And even the Crimea, they're still going in with that kind of paradigm.
Oh, yeah.
That's their mindset, because all the people in charge are all guys who have been in the armies for many years, and the smoothbore way of warfare that's where their mind is. And it took a lot of effort to try and on behalf of certain individuals to sort of to find out what the capabilities of the new rifle are, and then embrace them. Right. And then
one of the things I thought was interesting about that book about embracing it is, even after seeing the success with the Minier rifle in the Crimea, a lot of the top British were not interested in switching to a rifle. They still thought a smoothbore was the way to go.
The sort of famously, the Duke of Wellington was very reactionary in that sense. The Iron Duke, as his nickname or moniker was. And, that's perhaps part of the reason why the Minier rifle was 702 caliber, which is the same caliber as the smoothbore before it. And whereas the P53 obviously is a smaller bore than that. But that was sort of to placate he famously said that the ratio of rifles in the army doesn't need to be any different than it was at Waterloo, because it was effective in the Peninsula. It was effective at Waterloo. And I know, and we all, like, the paradigm is there, and that's the smoothbore paradigm. And in his mind, and, to a degree, rightfully so, he's the victor of Waterloo. So who's going to argue with you? You beat Napoleon. So, though that whole thing kind of, it festers a little bit, and it keeps the army sort of behind. Might they have adopted the rifle a little bit earlier? Because the 40s were a bit of a formulation or formulative era when all this technology was starting to be both percussion, ignition, and also rifling, and the expanding ball kind of thing. That's when it gains its real meat and foothold. And that's why the weapons come out in the 50s, because the technology gets to the point where they're like, okay, time to adopt that now. Because the stuff that came before, some of the French stuff, the pillar breech, I don't know how you term it. The breech has got shoulders on it, and so the powder falls into the small part, and the round ball comes down on top and hits the shoulders, and then you pound on it, and it pounds and flattens it out on the shoulders, so it grips the rifle. The concept is there, but highly imperfect. Right. And it takes the combination of lubricant and expanding ball and all these things to come together. But even then, as Brett alludes to, in British service, the cartridge doesn't get perfected until the 1860s.
Jake.
With the
don't you have one of them Sniders?
What's that?
He's got a Snider he's been pretty fond of here lately. Old Jake from Everything Black Powder.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty
Yeah.
sweet rifle.
No, the
The
Snider's
Snider, the Snider was afterward, but
Oh yeah, no, you're talking about getting to modern cartridges.
it's a really interesting mix of old and new for sure.
Oh yeah.
And
but
that's interesting.
You're talking about the Pritchett bullet, right, Rob?
Well, for the Enfield, but in the Snider, it's actually the bullet they use in the Snider. If you take out the hollow nose, looks like an American Burton. It's got grease grooves or and whatnot, which aren't full of grease; they're full of wax, mind you. But it's got cannulars in it, just like a Burton does. And it's with the Snider, they go to that style of bullet, and which lasts obviously until the end of the Snider, which in Empire service goes right up until, well, in Canada we have the Snider until the 1890s, mid 1890s.
Wow,
That was the outside lubricated version, right? Not the inside lubricated. Or am I backwards here?
With the Snider?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Snider is the Snider's lubricated on the bullet in the same way that a Burton mini ball is. So the outside is coated in wax in the British.
Right.
But it's got.
I'm just kind of comparing it to the, your our heel-based bullets to our internally the way the bullets are kind of today.
it's not a heel base if that's what you're thinking.
It's not a heel-based bullet. Okay,
it's basically if you were to put a mini ball in a cartridge.
That's the best way to describe the Snider bullet.
Okay.
It's got a expanding plug in the base, and the nose of a Snider bullet is actually hollow. So actually, the Snider round was immensely destructive, more so than the Martini Henry, more so than the Enfield, because it was essentially a 520 grain hollow point.
Yeah, that would.
So the original Snider projectile was a hollow point, Rob?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Really?
Wow.
The first, there was 9 patterns of Snider cartridge and 5 patterns of bullet, I think, and all up until the Mark 8 or 7 or 8, maybe it was at Mark 7, the bullet was formed and it was spun, and the lead was sort of spun as the bullet's spinning. It was formed to close over the hollow. But up until that mark, and this all happened within these 9 patterns of cartridge, all happened in like 3 years, right? Like they went, this isn't good. Let's move to this one. Let's move to this one. And they just start the manufacture of the new one and progress with that until they've realized it could be further improved, because this is still brand new technology, right? But the previous marks had a wooden plug in the. I've got actually a one downstairs. I don't know if I'd be able to show you on the screen here, but it still has the wooden plug in the end and the wooden plug in the base. I'm just trying to think if you bear with me, I've got a quick book, and that'll show you a cutaway version. Hold on.
Yep.
Yeah.
Go for it.
If you guys lose me, I'm gonna try to. My left ear or my right earbud is pretty much dead. So if you lose me, hopefully I put the other one in, so hopefully it'll pick up audio on mic on that. If it doesn't, just let me know and I'll turn it all off.
Okay.
All right.
So this is a Skennerton book, but there's a Snider bullet. You can see it's got the base plug and it's got the wood in the tip. And then
so it has a wooden insert in the tip then.
Yes, that's right. And then the later marks, whatever that one says, what does that say? Mark?
Boxer bullet
Type
type 5.
But you can see in the diagram how
it's hollow.
There, it's hollow, and the lead is actually spun over the top.
It's an interesting way of doing it versus just. I mean, you would instead of just pressing it into a mold or pouring it into a mold, they spun it. That's
they must be swaged then.
No, they're all swaged, and then as another process, it was spun, and the lead was
and then curved over.
So
did they do that because they didn't want such a heavy bullet? They wanted a lighter bullet. Is that why they kept it internally hollow?
No, they wanted to increase the stabilization.
And by putting the weight on the outside.
On the outside, yeah.
The weight to the outside, yeah. And then inadvertently they found that the destructive effects, the terminal effects, were like, wow, that's pretty impressive.
I bet.
Right? Because that's obviously it's a 5.77. By the time it leaves the barrel, it's 5.77. It's 5.75 when it's made.
So
But
that's a
it's
big hollow point.
expanded to the size of the bore, and it's hollow point, so it's like tearing arms off and whatever the destructive, capacity of the bullets used, as is exemplified by the stories that come out of the American Civil War. You can double that for the Snider.
Wow.
So is that the idea for the hollow point 303 Dum-dum round that you always hear about?
That's because, and now you're comparing the 45 caliber Martini Henry bullet, which is 12 to 1 tin lead or lead tin, like quite hard.
Yeah.
And it's zipping, the hitting power of that is significant. And then the 303 round comes in and it's jacketed and it's literally just blowing through, making very little disturbance, or comparatively so, to the Martini. And they see this, like, wait a minute, we're shooting people and it doesn't have the effect that we want.
Doesn't do what we want.
And
we're making small holes instead of big holes.
Yeah. The Mark II Special is what is like the Dum-dum, and it's made in India, and it's got an exposed core at the front. So they trim the jacket just like a modern hunting round.
Yeah.
And then from there they go through 3 marks of hollow point.
Yep.
And some of them have a little iron cup in the tip to help the expansion, and then they get rid of that. And then right in, was it 898? They are producing these as the way forward, and then the Hague Conventions come into effect, and distorting bullets are no longer suitable for warfare. Bullets that change their shape in that way. And so all that ammunition is then used for training purposes. And there's accounts on the British sailing to South Africa during the Second Boer War. They're issued all this Mark V ammunition to use on the ship, to target practice out to sea, and for times in training. But when they actually end up going into action, they've all got, at that point, Mark II. They've gone back to the Mark II. At the Sudan expedition in 1898, the Army spends huge amounts of time with their Mark II ammunition. They issue them by the hundreds of thousands to battalions during the workup phase to the campaign. And they're issued big chunks of railroad rail to use as anvils to hold bullets on. So you've got a work surface, and the troops sit around with files, and they take their ammunition and they file the nose off the bullets. And then they repackage them and put them back in the boxes, because the hollow point ammunition, though, like the Mark 345, hasn't come into service yet to the degree they want. So they've taken all the old ammunition and they're going to fight the Sudanese, not the Sudanese, the Mahdists, outside. Ultimately, they end them meet them in a number of battles, the at Barra and most famously at Omdurman in 1898. And the idea is that all the stockpiles of ammunition that the British are taking with them are going to have some degree of deforming capability, whether they're come that way as a Mark V, which we're talking about it. I can't say for sure that the Mark V was out in time for that, but the stories go, and there's accounts of it. The Mark II noses are being filed off en masse as like your job today. Number 3 company, come
McKinsey?
Here, draw your 100
ammo and file it down.
Yep, and go and sit on the anvil over there. Your 80 guys, and you guys for the day are going to file noses off bullets. And here's the files, here's your bullets, and this is the length at which you need to file them to. Off you go. And they all sit there and file, make a big pile, and then wrap it all back up into paper wrappers and put them all back in the storage boxes. And then,
nice.
The next day, come in for your next 100,000.
But I think I heard it. Yeah, I did hear it from Othnius on Seeing Arsenal.
Yep.
He had talked about the Germans were making claims that the British were taking the hole in the SMLE magazine and trying to use it to basically cut the tips off their 303 bullets.
No, that was it's the hole in the side of the cutoff.
Yeah.
The little nub on the cutoff that you grip to move it in and out.
Yeah,
it's hollow. Yeah, they're making ridiculous claims. And that was also because the Mark 7 ammunition, of which the Army was using at the time, had an aluminum tip inside the jacket. So it had a lead antimony core slug, and then it had an aluminum tip, and then it had the jacket around everything. That was
aluminum tip back then, that would have been expensive.
It was what they figured. They wanted to save some weight and increase the velocity, and that was one way of doing it. And then it had the effect when it hit something was that it immediately destabilized. So when it hit, it just
started to tumble.
It started to tumble immediately. So in that sense, quite effective than a solid lead bullet.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But that's the Mark 7 it comes in 1910, and that's the Spitzer high velocity 303 round, 174 grains to 2000. Well, I guess nominally 2440 is the velocity, the nominal velocity. And as I said, and Spitzer pointed. Before that, the Mark II, Mark VI is all 215 grain round nose, about 2,000 feet per second, so a bit slower. And that's what the British Army uses in the 1890s and the Boer War. And
are those black powder rounds?
I'm sorry?
Are those black powder rounds, Rob?
The first 303 rounds are black powder. They're done that and made that way because they are trying to find an appropriate smokeless powder for use around the world in all conditions. And the ones that are out there at that time in the 1890s, or sorry, in the 1880s, are not suitable. Like the French powder, which is famously what they use in the Lebel, was a powder B. Why didn't they just use that? Well, I guess it had some issues with either heat or cold, like whether it be Canada or India, all the places that the British Empire exists. So they had to find something different, and they ended up with Cordite, which you may or may not. You're aware of Cordite. It looks like spaghetti. Right? Yep. But those black powder rounds, that's the way the 303 is initially produced. You can't. Well, sure you can, but to do it with normal methods is almost impossible because it's formed in a pellet and it's put into the case. And that pellet has a hole through the middle of it, like longitudinally, like from top to bottom, to help in the flash from the primer to burn it all. And it's put into the case before it's necked.
Yeah, so the case is sized with the charge. Yes,
the bullet's put in necked with the charge in it. So it's very difficult to replicate that, right? To get there's how many grains are in the? It's like 70 some odd grains, 70 grains of powder. So I mean, it's compressed significantly into a pellet. I don't have my papers here, and I'm pretty sure it's something like that.
I've heard that the British were a little late getting to use smokeless in there. Do you know what year they started using smokeless in 303s?
They produce black powder rounds for a couple of years, so then they start producing Cordite in 91.
Oh, okay.
91.
Smokeless was invented in 84, right?
86.
Right.
I think, right?
86?
Right. But again,
about
like 2 years difference here and there. None of that really matters because the time it takes for all these nations to get things into play. Like the Lebel wasn't in the hands of the French army in 1888 or whatever, or whatever it was. It took years to.
It was nothing but an experimental rifle at that time, technically.
But they had to make them in the numbers and then issue them everywhere. Right. So everything came later. Like everyone talks about, the British Army had the Lee-Metford in 1888. Well, no, it didn't. The Lee-Metford was issued generally for the first time in 1890.
That's like here in America, everybody talks about the Spanish-American War. Everybody talks about the Krag. What people don't realize is a lot of guys going down to Cuba are still carrying trapdoors.
Trapdoors.
So, yep.
But there's the way that the number or the pattern associated with a given rifle, whether it be American or Spanish or British or whatever.
Yeah, it doesn't really incorporate
it, but that never means when it's in the hands of the troops.
Hands of the troops, right.
So as they say, 1890 is the first real year of full Lee-Metford issue, but there are units in 1892 that are just getting the Lee-Metford.
Right.
They've had Martinis up until that point, and by that point, cordite ammunition is the version that's being manufactured. So cordite is in service before Martini Henrys are out of service.
That's pretty funny.
Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't use black powder rounds throughout the 1890s for other purposes. But just like anything, you start manufacturing millions of rounds, then those go into store and issued down to whatever level into ammunition depots in peacetime. And then the production sort of line coming in behind that, they just switch over to cordite and they stop producing black powder. So eventually over time, that black powder stock will diminish. And at some point, you'll have enough cordite to get rid of all the black powder, period. And then that final chunk that's left in store can be just withdrawn and disposed of or whatever. And then there's obviously a number of marks, the Mark II, and then the Dum-dum thing comes in the late 90s, and then the Mark VI at the end of that, which is a slightly improved Mark II. And then that lasts until 1910, and then they start producing the Spitzer. So, the regular army that goes to war in 1914, they have rifles that are all sighted, and the chambering's no different, but predominantly it's the sights and the magazine. Some of the magazine geometry is different because the bullet's a different shape.
Mhm.
And there's an account, the London Scottish go into action in 1914, which is a territorial battalion. So part-time soldiers before the war, they're part of the mobilization. And the territorial army in Britain is like a totally different beast from the regular army. But their rifles are SMLEs, but they're all still chambered for the Mark VI. And so they experience feeding issues because when they go into action and get into France, they, or Belgium as the case may be, at the Crimson Messine, they're issued Mark VII, which is the frontline proper ammunition that is used at the time. But their rifles are older versions that are intended to be used with Mark VI. They'll fire them okay. There's no safety issue or anything like that. But they have problems feeding them, and there's some
feeding issues
regarding that. I know we're getting off on a tangent here, but those first 303 rounds are black powder. It was never made as black powder. It was never intended that it is a black powder rifle in being a Lee-Metford, because often the correlation between Metford rifling and black powder is made because Metford rifling had existed quite some time before that and was deemed a very suitable rifling for black powder arms because there's no hard angles in it. It's a series of, it's not quite polygonal in the sense of numerous angles and facets, but the rifling, if you imagine a picture of a cross section of a bore with rifling cut into it in square little notches, we'll just round all those notches out. And the rifle,
I know what you're talking about.
Like a wave, and those waves form the rifling. So because there's no edges in it, the fouling issue is significantly decreased.
Reduced.
So there is a correlation between black powder and Metford rifling, but it was always going to be Metford rifling, regardless of what powder they ended up being. So there's often a correlation. It's like Metfords are used with black powder or for black powder, and then they went to Lee-Enfield when they got cordite. Well, it's much more complicated than that. The Metford was chosen. I mean, what kind of rifling's in an Arisaka? Does anybody know?
I'm not first in Arisaka, the Japanese stuff.
Metford.
Is that
Is it really?
So does Metford have rifling have anything to do with smokeless ammunition or black powder or non-smokeless or non-black powder? No.
Yeah, neither.
It's just a style. But what they found was when they did go to cordite, an unforeseen effect of cordite and excessive use of it was that it burns much hotter, like temperature-wise. It's hotter than other smokeless powders. So it was burning out the barrels of the Metford because the Metford rifling is admittedly quite shallow, and it was burning the throats out. And this takes like thousands of rounds, 6,000 rounds, and it was deemed to be, some degree of wear to the point which it would become unserviceable. This took time, and the fact that they discovered this led them to adopt the Lee-Enfield, which is exactly the same rifle, only with a different type of rifling, which is more conventional square cut rifling into it, and slightly deeper. And that was deemed as being able to resist the heat and have a longer barrel life. But the rifle was external. Apart from the rifling, it was identical. between the Mark II Star Lee-Metford and the Mark I magazine Lee-Enfield. They're the same rifle except for the rifling, for all intents and purposes. So, does that mean they withdraw or rebarrel all the Lee-Metfords that they've got? Thousands of them.
I wouldn't think so.
Not. They use them until they're worn out, and in many cases, they're used all the way through the Boer War as Lee-Metfords, because they haven't arrived at that number of rounds through them where the ammunition is burning the barrel out. But when they do, they get sent back and rebarreled into Enfields. And they become Lee-Enfields after that. They get remarked and everything, and they become Lee-Enfields. So, as I say, the story of that whole black powder 303 thing is it's layers upon layers, and they're all interwoven. There's not some sort of line in the sand saying Metford, black powder, Enfield, smokeless, Cordite. It's absolutely not like that at all. And most importantly, they were never intended from the outset to be a black powder rifle. It was just this association of the rifling and the black powder ammunition, and misunderstanding or misinterpreting what that means.
And the Metford rifling wearing out, is that just because it was more shallow rifling? I wonder why it's more susceptible to the Cordite.
There's less metal, but the Cordite burns way hotter. So it was, the temperature was actually burning, and after,
so it'd be flame erosion, basically like flame erosion.
Sure, that's the one way to put it. Yeah, it was just the actual temperature of the combustion was much hotter than other smokeless powders. So it's one of those things that I wouldn't say is a crusade, not by any means, especially on my channel, but it's a topic I've often discussed, and it's something that comes up every now and again. Is that kind of perhaps one of those internetisms and things like that? It's spread very quickly.
Oh yeah.
In our own genres, we have our own thing that we've always come across, that you're constantly kind of, actually not really. It's a bit different than that. There's more nuance. There's more context. But let's talk about that. That kind of thing.
Trust me, I know that feeling a lot. I do Colt pistols. I am a Colt pistol guy, and there's more of that with those than you can imagine. There's so much out there that is just not true, or
R.L. Wilson.
Yeah.
R.L. Wilson,
Snapper's favorite author.
Well, I mean, yeah, sure. When it comes to people who write things in history, like, I'm not a person who will hate on somebody if they messed up on accident. Like, hey, this is with the knowledge we know. But if you're doing it to make a profit, or if you're doing it to physically rip people off or put your name out there, I'm completely different when it comes to that. I don't mind kicking somebody when they're down like that. But yeah, I hate that guy a lot. He ruined so much of my history. Had to go back through and learn everything just because of him. Especially, most of us that are younger, we didn't start doing this that long ago. And there's a lot of the internet traps that you don't know until you really start studying, like just studying the history. And the deeper you get into it, then you realize, wow, I just wasted like 2 years of my time because all this is garbage. And and the thing too is there's a lot of just myths about Colts that it is so much deeper in engineering and the fact of what it is and why it happened. But most people just say, oh, it's because it was just garbage, or it was just crap, or they didn't know what they were doing. And it was kind of like the way you're going with this. It's so much deeper, and it's a lot bigger conversation piece that it's very nuanced. It's much deeper than most people think.
Yeah, for sure. And oftentimes there are mistakes made, and there's things that should have happened that didn't. But oftentimes, those are tempered with honest sort of discovery of things.
Right. And most of us we care more about the history.
Thing. They had no idea until they put it in service, really.
Exactly. So you couldn't hate them for that.
6,000 rounds to this thing, and you're like, oh boy, these test rifles are starting to show wear. Boy, there might be a problem here. Well, let's examine it further. Oh, there is a problem. Okay, well, let's switch it around. How long do those last? 6,000 rounds. Well, an average soldier, his rifle's going to have maybe 200 rounds to it a year. When he does his annual qualification, right?
So you have years before you really need to worry about it.
Exactly. Right. Now, put it in a context of service, active service, maybe there's a lot more ammunition going through it.
Right.
And that at the end of 6 years of service use, and you start seeing things that go wrong. Another thing with the Enfields, when the Enfield comes in, they manufacture the sights incorrectly. They offset them because of the drift of the bullet at longer range and the way, because it spins and it sort of
yeah.
So they offset the sights to compensate, but they do that too much. Like,
Really?
Those are all
math was done wrong, or they were anticipating
Right.
different, and so they realized that in South Africa, and there's problems with the shooting. And one of the interesting kind of discoveries I made was my Lee-Metford has an Enfield barrel on it, and that Enfield barrel had not been modified. And when I first got it, I was shooting 6 inches right at 100. And I'm like, what is going on? Am I holding this wrong? And what? Because the sights are unadjustable.
right.
And I started researching. It's like, what is this? Is not the case. Tried some different ammunition. Everything was right. Everything. And
That's a lot for 100 yards.
What's that? Sorry.
That's a lot. 6 inches at 100 yards, quite a bit for a rifle. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, you're not going to hit anything out in any distance.
So ended up coming through the research and found the cause of it and why, and the remedy. And there were 3 remedies. Either manufacture the rifle properly from the get-go, like starting now, make the adjustment on manufacturing. Second, ones in store could be taken back to the shop essentially and had the front sight milled off and a new dovetailed barleycorn put on at the correct offset and then staked. And the third was issue a different back sight with an offset notch.
Okay.
And I was able to actually track one of those down, and it's noticeable. I've made a couple of videos showing it. When you look at it, you can see the offset of the notch, and it's further to the right.
Wow.
And it's a plug and play. You just change the back sight, take the pin out, put the new one in, slide the pin back in, took it to shoot, and it's dead on. So I arrived, which is really an interesting story for me, especially being interested in that kind of thing, but also in the sort of the story of the channel, is I came across a problem that I had no idea existed in reality, like in history. And I found a way to fix it that matched the exact historical experience. And
that's awesome, isn't it?
The numbers were correct. I remember I have a figure of merit calculator. It's a spreadsheet program that you input data from rounds in the target in relation to a grid. And then that tells you the size of the group. Also shows you the figure of merit, which is a different way of measuring accuracy. And then it also, if you input your sight radius, it also gives you adjustments up and down and left and right to move your sights, to bring, as long as you input your point of aim,
the correct information
on the target, and your intended your main point of impact, it calculates and if
to where your intended point of aim would be,
your main point of impact to be, it'll calculate that, and using your sight radius, it'll give you the correction you need to put to your sights mathematically. And the number that I got in shooting all those groups, doing all that using the spreadsheet, was the exact number. It's 3/100ths of an inch. Was the exact number that the historical documentation said they made the adjustment by. So it was
it's cool, isn't it?
For me, anyway, it was a real kind of cool discovery. Yeah.
Oh, I agree. I kind of run into weird little things like that every now and then, not quite the same, but I'm an engineer, and breaking down some of these old guns and actually looking at what they were actually doing, it's fascinating how simple these guns are, but how much safety was built into them. Like, it is phenomenal. They're drop safe. They're everything safe. It's everybody, every person who ever watches this show all the time, one of the biggest things I go into is the safety notch on a single action army, that the reasons are very different from historically than what people think. They weren't breaking every day. They were actually extremely strong, like extremely strong. You'd need to get hit with an artillery piece for you to break this stupid thing. Most of it was the reasons why they went away from it. They thought it was unsafe was importation laws, and B, putting it on safe was a hazardous. So you had to cock the hammer all the way back, pull the trigger, and then let it down manually.
Right.
And they were having incidents. They were having, people misfires, negligent discharges because they're putting it on safe. And everybody thinks, oh, it was because they were breaking the safety notch. Yes, they could break, but you need so much. You need almost like 1,000 foot-pounds of torque to break the stupid thing. So it's like, yeah, it could break, and it would happen, I'm sure, but likely it wasn't going to happen.
It's sort of like the half cock on a musket, right?
Exactly. Same kind of thing.
The tumbler of a musket in a lock, like that sear needs to come like backward.
It has to go back to go forward. Yeah.
And then be pulled down for it to go forward. So what are the chances? Unless that shears off completely, which, like you say, when you slam it with a sledgehammer, it will.
Yeah.
But the chances of it being dropped and having that spring on the sear, keeping that sear up against it, even if it does swing back and away from the bent, it's going to come
so
right
unlikely.
back into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you would, in what I calculated, is you needed over 1,000 foot-pounds, around 1,000 foot-pounds of torque with mild steel, not the steel they're actually using. The steel they're actually using, you're going to need 1,500 to almost 2,000 foot-pounds of torque to break the stupid thing. The screw actually breaks, believe it or not. It's not the notch that breaks. It's not the trigger that breaks. It's the trigger screw actually deforms and plasticizes itself downward. And then it could go off, obviously, but we're talking some serious hit. I mean, you have to drop this thing over, more than 15 feet directly onto its.
You'd have to drop it out of an airplane.
Basically.
Well, that's
like
one of my favorite complaints I get on the channel a lot of times, because I've been practicing more on it here lately, but I load a lot of paper cartridges and smoothbore muskets. And, I've been practicing the drill a lot more here lately, the proper drill, I should say. But, the proper drill is you prime the pan first and then load the cartridge. And there's been several people who are like, that is eventually going to go off whenever you are, loading it. That sear is going to snap or it's going to jump over or something like that. And I was thinking to myself, I commented it a couple of times, this was done on a basis of tens of thousands of guys at a time would do this. And if it was that bad of an issue that it's going to be going off on half cock, do you think they might not have changed some things up a little bit? It's like that safety notch on that Colt. Yeah.
And the thing too is I can see like some ranges while they will have some rule, because if somebody does something stupid, you could get sued because somebody else's mistake. So you can throw in a lot of rules into things like sport shooting and all that stuff, just to keep everybody safe and keep yourself liable away from law. But the way I see it is, if you're a grown adult and you can take responsibility for your own actions, if the thing shoots me, then that's my fault.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And that's kind of the way I've always looked at it personally. I'm not going to sit there and then go say, oh man, I knew I shouldn't have been doing that, and I'm going to sue Colt because I knew I was going to, or whoever, because I knew I wasn't supposed to be doing it. If it's just being an adult, taking responsibility for your own actions, and if you're responsible enough to do it, then do it. If you're not, then stay away from guns.
This is the way I'm going to do it on my video, and if you don't like it, go make your own video.
There's something to be said for
I know somebody who has that.
Actually, having the historical moniker next to what you're doing as well is that you're demonstrating.
Yeah, exactly. You're not just being reckless either. You're just like, this is how they did it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if it didn't work, if it won't work nowadays, if there's something wrong with it, guess what? It probably didn't work back then, and they probably would have gotten rid of the whole idea. So the fact that they kept the idea just proves that it works.
It worked.
And that's what I'm actually practicing the actual proper drill for the Brown Bess a lot here lately. And at first I was looking at it, I was like, man, that just seems like a lot of stuff that I could get wrong. But the more I do it, the more sense it really makes, especially the cast about when you throw the butt out behind you. It really makes loading it much, much easier. And you realize like it worked, and that's why they chose it.
Yeah, they weren't stupid back then.
Yeah, it's like they literally lived with this stuff.
Yeah.
That they didn't have the option to go to something else. This is what they're dealing with. So yeah, they're gonna find out what works and what's the best way of doing things like that.
Oh, by the way, Rob, congratulations on that amazing shot. I saw it on CN Arsenal with that pocket Colt, 31 caliber, 96 yards. Congratulations, man.
That was there's a saying about blind dogs and fire hydrants, right? Even blind dogs find a fire hydrant. That was exactly the case.
I'm a huge collector of originals. Everything behind you is original, except for the Walker. That's the only thing that's not. And I got a bunch of other ones here in front of me, but I have an original one of the gun you did that with, and that is not an easy shot with an original. 96 yards. Yeah, that's pretty good. Were you aiming directly at it?
Well, I think I was aiming above it.
Well, so you're aiming above it. Okay. Because you shoot high, but man, I don't know if I overcompensate because I don't even try shooting that far. It's kind of ridiculous that you can try with a little 31 caliber.
That was literally, we got it loaded and then let's try for that one.
And it worked, huh?
Yeah. Well, I think a thigh shot it and hit it as well. And then loaded
Yeah, it showed that he did it too. That's pretty awesome. That means that thing was zeroed pretty much right on. Yeah. That's pretty cool.
So it was fun. I'm a horrible handgun shot. So when I say that it was a blind dog and fire hunted, I'm speaking from the.
Don't worry, so am I.
Well, here's a question for you, Rob. Yeah. Have you ever handled the Webleys, like the Mark VI particularly? That's one of my favorite revolvers.
That's. I was just going to say. Can you guys screenshot?
Ethan can, I think.
Garrett,
call Garrett in here quickly.
Garrett, come here. We need your assistance.
I'm just gonna, if I could find it real quick, I'd answer your question.
Real quick, Rob. By the way, that Sea Service pistol, that is a battlefield pickup from the War of 1812.
Oh wow!
I bought it from a museum in New Orleans. That cool. It was actually found near its premise, and
I was wanting to put up a picture of something.
Of what? Who is?
Something.
I don't know if I can.
Yeah. I don't know how well that works. I don't know anything about running this thing.
What are you trying to pull up, Rob?
I was just going to show you a picture.
If you email it, and then I can put it up.
Okay, no, don't worry about it. It was just a picture of me shooting a Webley.
Oh.
Yeah, that was.
So what do you think of it?
Sorry.
What do you think of the Webley?
Oh, it's I mean, it's a beast. It's big. But it's. I had a great time shooting it. I shot it okay. Formally, we found some practices out of the manual, and they're pretty simple. They're like the more like familiarity shooting, both hands, single and double action, and just at a really simple bullseye target. I started off okay, and then things went downhill very quickly.
Yeah, that's how it usually works.
Like really bad.
That's how it works.
Yeah, and which is funny because I have shot more modern stuff, in what you might call more modern techniques, like two-handed stuff, and I shot reasonably well with a bit of practice. But I'm completely out of practice, and that was a number of years ago. And shooting one-handed with a Webley is a little bit different. So, although I was trying to remember all the tenets of shooting revolvers, it obviously didn't manifest itself in some expert shooting. That's for sure.
You can always tell when somebody gets mad, especially if they're a historical shooter. You'll see them grab both hands. So they're not hitting the target. Yeah, that's how you can always tell when somebody historically shooting gets mad.
Yeah. The Webley stuff is all pretty simple, formal, like one hand. This stuff, right?
Yeah. And that's that old school Colt style shooting too.
The Enfield stuff, like the World War II revolver shooting, is funny enough. There's prone shooting supported. Yeah,
nice.
Modern
military does that.
Yeah, so you're lying on the ground behind a sandbag with your revolver.
Yep.
And then most of it actually, apart from the very first couple of practices, everything else is done like James Bond style. So if you think of the opening of a James Bond movie where he walks in the rifling of the gun and then he turns and shoots like from the hip or like kind of from the chest.
Yep.
That's exactly the way that all the shooting's done. So nothing's using the sight, not even looking up, raising it.
Point firing. Yep.
That's how it's sort of done between the belly and the chest. So that took a bit of getting used to as well.
I know the FBI in the 70s. It actually works pretty good at close range.
Yeah,
it does close range. We did that same kind of stuff when I went through for Beretta, shooting Berettas back when I was in the Army. They had point shooting and then distance shooting and prone, supported, unsupported, all that stuff.
Right.
Well, they just switched the pistol. I mean, I say just switched. They switched it a few years ago.
Yeah, they did it a while ago.
It's like you were saying, Rob, that they made the switch in 2018, but Like the unit I'm in right now, we just now got them here a few months ago.
Right.
The new pistols, and yeah, they've completely switched out the whole qualification. Now it's all fast. Some of it's from the hip. I will tell you this though: those new pistols, we put 4,000 rounds through them a piece, and we had rear sights falling off. We had triggers
Wow.
dead. Yeah, they might need to go work on those pistols just a little bit more.
Yeah, what make are they?
They're 6
Those
hours
six.
Figs.
M17s. Yeah,
Mhm.
rear sights falling off. It was they weren't doing too well.
That would have been hard for me to give up the Beretta. I love the Beretta M9. It was such a good gun to me. Anything. I hated it when I had it, but it ended up being my favorite gun of all time.
Oh yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
the other thing is they're wanting to do suppressors now with these pistols for some reason.
Ooh,
And so they
fun.
have suppressor sights and standard sights. Well, the problem is these pistols they gave us, they had suppressor rear sights, standard front sights. So it was, it was really hard to hit with one of those things. Let's see here. Well, I think we're probably about ready to wrap her on up, guys.
Yeah, I'm going to just try something here. Maybe not record this computer screen.
We really need to sit down, Ethan, and play with this and see what we can actually do. We never really sit down earlier before these and see what we can actually do
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
with this.
No,
camera.
I was actually running trying to get a video made before this happened because I've literally, if you couldn't tell by the nice sunburn, been outside shooting this rifle.
I noticed that earlier when you pulled your hat up.
He was very well nice and tanned.
It was a little warm. But we got a lot of rounds downrange with this old rifle. So, well, I say
Nice.
old, it's like literally 2
Brand
weeks
new.
old.
Yeah,
Brand new.
Brand new.
But yeah.
Well, it's gotten more rounds through it now in one day than probably most of those actually get in their entire lifetime.
Yeah, probably. There's one target I'm not too proud of that may or may not have like 50 holes in it all over the place. But you're right. I tried this out there at 350 yards. Man, I was sitting there and I was holding 4 feet over the target. And it didn't matter how much it seemed like I was raising up over the target. I always seemed to hit right below it.
And what kind of load do you fire with that?
So I found the best load is a 49 caliber ball and a 90 grain powder charge of 2F. Yeah, so it's not too bad. Let's see here. Well,
I don't know, Rob, if in where you live, if you can make your black powder legally, but holy cow, if you can actually make it, you can make it just as good as well, Swiss is hard to make, but if you shoot GoX, follow Jake's instructions, and you can easily make black powder as good as GoX all day long.
I'd say something I've been interested in it, but never had the time really to sit down and get it all set up. And
it is a time consuming, especially when you go into corning and stuff.
Yeah.
But
it's tedious. There's no doubt about
Brett's
it.
done a lot of experimentation, and that's who I've predominantly talked to about it. And he follows things pretty to a high standard, I guess. In terms of like pressing the cake, to a certain PSI and all that kind of stuff.
Pretty amazing how good you can make that stuff from home. And it's cheap compared to buying
glaze it as well.
What's that?
Are you able to glaze it?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I was just talking to Jake here. I've been kind of looking into, because like I said, talking a lot about that pattern 1776 rifle. And I'm sure you're aware, they talk about in the book the extra fine double strength glazed powder. And the best I could find the information on that was a book that Duke Fraser sent me there. See if I can pull it up here, because I had downloaded it on my phone because that was the cheapest way to do it. Let's see, I'll pull it up here. But what I found is basically extra fine is 2F powder, and the double strength is double corned, and then obviously glazed. So it's a 2F double corned powder that's been glazed, and I think that's what I'm going to run in that rifle. I think it's what 86 grains is what they say that he thought they would have used. I'm trying to find the name of that book, but yeah, well, there it is. Yeah,
It makes shooting extremely inexpensive compared to what it would normally be.
Yeah, is the chemistry of powder and explosives by Davis. So they kind of went into a little bit of that. So I'm pretty excited about making that.
Well, especially if you can make it cheaper, right?
Yeah,
Way
exactly.
cheaper.
Oh yeah,
Way
And
cheaper.
what kind of charcoal and what kind of wood?
So the wood I'm going to go with for that powder, because what I'm finding, mostly British woods are going to be for charcoal is either beech. I found a couple of sources on that, or the good old standby of willow, which we've got a lot of willow down here. It grows down on the river. And we found actually we'll take the, and I don't know, Jake, if you ever experimented with this, but the willow we're using is kind of rotten, kind of punky. It's older willow. It seems
that
to
makes
work
better powder.
Yeah, it seems to work better.
You bet.
So more porous, I guess. I'd assume. But
what's the name of that? The stuff that makes the very best stuff, Jake? I can't think of the name right now. Alder buckthorn.
Yeah, that was another one that they mentioned in another source I was reading that some British powders were made out of was alder wood.
That stuff's pretty good. Apparently, it's the best. It supposedly makes more gas than any other wood.
It makes the most powerful powder that I've ever made.
Yeah.
Now, Jake, I'm sure you've experimented with it before, but I just got myself a bunch of wild grapevine.
Yeah,
how does that work?
Grapevine works well
good?
Too. It's about the same as willow.
Yeah. Okay.
What we're working on now? My brother told me not to tell anybody, but I'll tell you guys.
Yeah.
We're going to build what they call an edge runner mill, because that's how Swiss makes their powder, and that's how, in that book I read of Brett's, that's how the British made their stuff. And what it is if you Google like a wet pan mill or something, like you'll see stuff that they use for like mining gold, but it's like a trough or a pan with these big rollers, and they spin slowly and just roll on it. So it basically like folds it and rolls it over on itself, and it's done wet. Not really wet, just a little wet.
Little wet.
Yeah.
Huh.
And
that
as soon as I saw that, as soon as I saw that, I thought, man, that's the way to go, because you don't have any way of getting any contaminant in there, like lead or brass or whatever it is you're using in your ball mill.
Right.
That might be the answer. That might be the answer to finally make good stuff.
It's just the problem's going to be moving those 3-ton stone wheels into the living room.
Well, ours is going to be like hobby size.
Quarter-ton wheels.
Tell you this, making your own black powder is pretty nice, because just through this rifle alone today, I ran through a horn and a half. So over a pound of powder in just a rifle. Duke wants to know if you ever tried cottonwood, Jake.
What's that?
Duke wants to know if you ever tried cottonwood charcoal.
I don't think I have tried cottonwood. I've heard.
What about balsa?
I think that's what the Confederacy used in the Civil War. I think they used cottonwood, and they supposedly had better powder.
Yeah.
Any luck with that balsa yet, or no?
No, I haven't. I was talking to my brother yesterday, and I said we need to char that stuff up and make some with it. Snapper's going to ask me pretty soon.
Yep. No, I don't care, man. I'm just curious, dude.
Well, anyhow, guys, I think we're about ready to wrap her on up. Yeah. So I guess.
Yeah. I'm sorry I wasn't able to find that book.
Oh,
I'm just it's pissed me off. Let me look one more spot before we call her quits.
Oh, you're fine.
Okay.
Well, you got quite the library there. I'm a little bit jealous.
Yeah, me too.
That's just
there's more money in books than guns.
Yeah.
That's when you know you got it right.
Oh yeah.
I'm looking forward to the video on that woods runner, Ethan.
Yeah, it should be hopefully coming out tomorrow. I still got to edit it tonight, so it's going to be a long night.
Wow, gonna put it out tomorrow. Good man.
Try to. I'm gonna try. We ain't splitting playing cards yet, but maybe.
You'll get there. It'll do it.
Yeah.
I can't even see the playing card when it's sideways, let alone split it.
It's tough to see. You kind of have to guess where it is.
Yeah, I split.
You have to
playing
shoot where
cards.
you think
More
it is.
instinctive, more instinctive shooting than anything.
I split playing cards with a 38 Smith and Wesson, or not Smith and Wesson, 38 Special.
Okay.
Flintlock's going to be a little bit tricky, but I might have to try it.
What distance do you do that at, anyways, Jake?
Oh, between 10 and 15 yards.
Yeah.
Man, I could barely hit a water bottle at that.
Well,
So I wasn't able to find the light infantry one I was talking about earlier, but there's the.
With zeal and with bayonets only. Okay.
Oh yeah, I got to check that out. That sounds pretty good.
Like it's like, admittedly, I mean that's the subject of the book there.
Yeah.
But yeah, like really eye-opening stuff.
Okay.
And
I do have to say, Rob, it's pretty amazing your memory on all that stuff. When I start learning this stuff,
Yeah.
it's almost like I have to forget stuff to remember, like learn new stuff.
Or you do like me and you just
So-
mix it all up together and you get 400 yards.
Yeah.
It happens. That's why whenever I make a video, I may or may not go and do myself a quick back brief before I get out there. So don't do
I have
that.
to, or I'll sound like a fool.
Let's see here. Well, I guess, guys, I'm not seeing any more questions. So, we'll go ahead and end the chat. Thank you guys for watching. Want to thank Jake and Snapper over there for joining us in the live chat. And most of all, just really like to thank Rob down there for joining us. I really appreciate you coming on here.
That was. I mean, honestly, that felt like about half an hour, and it's almost.
It's
3.
been 3.
Yeah.
That was a good chat.
That's
It was a good chat.
That's going well when the time flies.
Oh,
Yep.
yeah. Well, anyhow, guys.
It was great to meet everybody. I hope we'll get another
You
chance
too, Rob.
to talk again.
Okay. Now, Rob, just so you
thank
know,
Rob.
we'll probably be, when I end this broadcast, it'll still be going for a little bit. So, all righty. As always, thank you for watching. Trust in God and keep your powder dry. Bye. And